Okay, Mayor, I have my devices rolling and the floor is yours.
Thank you and good evening. This is the City of Morro Bay City Council regular meeting. It is Tuesday, April the 13th, 2021 at 5:30 p.m. Pursuant to Section 3 of Executive Order N29-20 issued by Governor Newsom on March 17th, 2020, this meeting will be conducted telephonically through Zoom and broadcast live on cable channel 20 and streamlined on the city website. Please be advised that pursuant to the executive order and to ensure the health and safety of the public by limiting human contact that could spread the COVID-19 virus, the Veterans Hall will not be open for this meeting. Thank you very much. And with that, I will ask the clerk to establish a quorum, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councilmember Addis. I see Councilmember Addis. Councilmember Barton.
I'm present.
Councilmember Davis.
I am present.
Councilmember Heller.
Here.
And Mayor Heading.
Present. We do have a quorum. I will go ahead and call the meeting to order, and in your own way, ask for a moment of silence, please. Thank you. And with that, we will go ahead and ask for our flag to be placed on the screen, and I'll start us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Great. And I will ask our city attorney, Mr. Neumeier, do we have a closed session report, sir?
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. No closed session items to report tonight.
Thank you so much, Chris. With that, we will go ahead and move to Mayor and Council members' reports. Let's go ahead and start off with Council Member Heller this evening. Council Member Heller, any report?
No reports this evening. I would like to thank everybody, though, for sending in agenda correspondence and emails about various issues that are on the agenda tonight. I think I speak for everyone. I say we appreciate everyone's input and comments and thoughts about our local government. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember Heller. And let's go to Councilmember Addis. Any opening statements this evening?
I do have a couple of announcements to share. One is on April 21st with Women's March San Luis Obispo at 5:30 p.m. as part of Answering the Call. We will be featuring two staffers from the State Assembly Democrats office who are going to talk about redistricting in California. And just to let the public know what that is, California has over 53 U.S. representatives and 120 state legislators, and district lines are redrawn every 10 years after the U.S. Census. And so we'll be sharing information next Wednesday at 5:30 as part of Answering the Call of what you should keep your eye on when it comes to redistricting. And you can find that information at womensmarchslow.com or on social media at Women's March Slow. And then we got an email today from the League of Women Voters. They have a similar event on April 29th at noon. And they will be hosting the redistricting commissioner for this area. So they invite you to lunch with the League.
Great. Thank you, Councilmember Addis. Very much appreciated. Councilmember Barton, any announcements this evening?
No, Mr. Mayor.
All right. Councilmember Davis, sir, any announcements?
Yes, sir, Mr. Mayor.
Tonight, I'd like to recognize one of our special Morro Bay citizens, Helen Beard. Helen has been a tireless advocate for improved trash collection by the city, but she also walks the walk. She walks many miles every weekend picking up dozens of buckets full of trash that spill on the ground. Helen is a true trash hero, and I particularly appreciate her very much. And I think our entire staff does as well. I also want to express appreciation to my colleague, Council Member Jeff Heller. Jeff is working to provide his project management experience to renovate the old aquarium site for the Three Stacks and a Pub Brewing Company to move into later this summer. And I want to say thank you, Councilmember Heller, for helping out. Appreciate that very much. That's all, Mr. Mayor.
Well, thank you, Councilmember Davis, for that, and Councilmember Heller, I'll second that. Thank you for the work done there. We very much appreciate that. Wanted to just give the community a brief update on COVID-19. Most of you hopefully have been following the news and have seen that we are improving rather dramatically as a county. However, we do remain in the red tier, which is considered to be substantial. We are very close to moving to the orange tier. That could happen, in my sense, within possibly a week or two. We have about 20,827 cases as of today in the county. Of those, 196 are active. The case rates are coming down significantly at 5.4 on an adjusted per 100,000 population. Just 2 months ago, we were about 32.5. So you can see the dramatic decrease in case rate per 100,000, which is very positive. Our positivity rate is 2.1%. That continues to decline. And overall, our ICU bed capacity is good. At present, there's only one COVID individual in the ICU in SLO County and 4 patients that are hospitalized. And so to date, we've had 256 unfortunate deaths in the county. Those are markedly on the decline as well. So all of this is very good news. Some updates, with regard to vaccinations. We continue to administer significant numbers of vaccines in the county. To date, we've received over 117,000 doses of vaccine, of which 113,000 have been administered to our population. At present, roughly 35% of San Luis Obispo County residents have been immunized with at least one dose of the vaccine. So this truly is very good news on that front. All 3 clinics continue to operate for one at Cuesta College, the second in Aurora Grande, and the third in Paso Robles. We are doing a number of outreach, or the county is doing a number of outreach clinics to special at-risk populations. And also there continues to be significant supply available in our retail pharmacies. And so if you're calling the county and don't have an appointment, you might contact your local retail pharmacy. Doses are significantly available there. One of the most common questions I get about vaccines is, if you have had your first dose of a 2-dose vaccine administered outside of this county, can you get your second vaccine in San Luis Obispo County? The answer to that is no. You must go back to the county of origin to receive your second dose. And so if you have received your first dose in San Luis Obispo County, you also must receive your second dose within San Luis Obispo County. And so I know there's been some confusion in the community with regard to that. Lastly, in the news today, you may have heard about the requested pause for the use of Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. The FDA and the CDC has recommended that there be a pause or a stop in the administration of this particular one-dose vaccine. The reason for that is there have been identified across the U.S. About 4 to possibly 6 cases of what we call thromboembolism or clotting. It's a very low number compared to the number of individuals that have received the vaccine. However, the FDA has asked the CDC for the pause in order to look into this to make sure that the vaccine is safe. And so that vaccine will probably not be administered for a number of days until data can be collected and evaluated. The question I've been asked more recently is, if I have been vaccinated with Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is, again, a single-dose vaccine, am I at risk for this potential side effect? And the answer to that, or the recommendation by the CDC, is that if you have been vaccinated within 10 to 14 days with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and you have symptoms that include either shortness of breath, a potential clot in your calf area, or any unusual side effect that is above and beyond the expected potential headache, lassitude or lethargy, tiredness, and potentially mild fever. So specifically shortness of breath and any swelling in the calf area, you want to call your doctor to get further evaluation. If you're beyond 14 days, you're probably safe and have no concerns, but certainly if these symptoms develop, you should call your clinician immediately. More news to follow regarding Johnson & Johnson. This does not impact the other 2 vaccines that are available, including Moderna and Pfizer, which fortunately continue to be available in significant quantities to our county and counties across the state. So with that, thank you. We will go ahead and move on to our city manager, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mayor and council members and members of the community. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Just want to give a couple quick updates. On our website, you can find information about the new Public Works Director who I was able to hire from the city of Pasadena. The press release outlines his experience and really how excited we are to bring on somebody who will help make sure we get the wharf completed and address some of our other capital needs. The assistant city manager / administrative services director position and the fire chief positions are out for recruitment right now. And as council and community may recall, the finance director was converted into the assistant city manager / administrative services director position. And then we did hear the trash piece by Councilmember Davis, and Helen Beard is awesome. She sends us reports every weekend, really helps us kind of track down what the issues are. And I just wanted to give a quick update. Council approved additional funds for hiring part-time staff. And so we just hired 2 new folks within the last 2 weeks, and they've made a significant improvement already in our coverage for trash and restroom service over the weekend. And really, we think about the weekend as Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. So kudos to Matt Bishop and the consolidated maintenance team for getting people up and running. And thank you to the police department for providing them with the Kubota, which is an alternative vehicle, much like a golf cart, that allows us to maneuver more quickly through with the heavier traffic on the weekends when cars pile up and it's harder to get to and from the various areas on the waterfront. So it would be much more efficient in our operations. So thank you, Chief Cox, for that. That's all I have. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Scott. Very much appreciated. And glad to hear we're moving forward with getting that trash taken care of and picked up. With that, that'll move us to presentations. This evening, we do have Brooks Stayer, who is the Executive Director of the Integrated Waste Management Authority, here to present on IMWA. Thanks to Councilmember Heller for being our liaison to Integrated Waste Management Authority. We appreciate that. And with that, Dana, if we can promote Brooks to, looks like we have promoted Brooks. We'll go ahead and let either Councilmember Heller lead it off, or Brooks, if you're going to go ahead and do the presentation, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'll defer to Mr. Heller. He's the man of the hour, and he knows what's going on with us. So, and I was also going to say, if you have any questions I don't cover, ask him. He probably knows it.
Well, that's very gracious. Now, I must say, this is a big deal relative to climate change and the state legislation mandating how we manage our organics. And Brooks is in charge of this county agency, which has got its hands full educating the public as well as rolling out specific implementation actions. And we have some very aggressive targets that came out of Sacramento that we need to meet. And Brooks really is the expert, not me, but I appreciate that comment. Brooks, I'm going to hand it off to you. Go for it.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome again, Brooks.
Yes, I appreciate it, Scott. So SB 1383 was a climate bill that was passed by the state in 2016. And as I understood it, every agency in California was supposed to reduce emissions. And so Cal Recycle looked at methane coming from landfills. And you can see from the graph there, it was 20% of emissions statewide. And the largest single fraction of material that's going into landfills, and it's what decomposition of landfill causes methane, is organics, which is paper and food. And so they're really targeting food with this bill. The whole idea is that you're going to not put food in your garbage can, you're going to put it in your green can, and then it can no longer be composted in a normal way or landfilled. It has to be composted in a way that the emissions are reduced or captured, and that the product of that becomes something useful. And so it's the biggest thing the state has done solid waste in for sure 30 years, if not ever. The problem was the final language was not drafted and approved until November of last year. So it gave us 13 months to implement the biggest thing the state's probably ever done in solid waste. So we've been really working hard to get this done. It's got to be implemented, the first phase, by next January. So we have 9 months left. So as Jeff said, there's some aggressive targets here. So let me just break it down for you. There are 7 major focuses of it. The biggest one is the actual organic service. So you're going to go to every household and every business and every multifamily and provide them with the 3-can system. And it's been at single family homes and larger businesses for a while, for a few years, but it hasn't been at thousands of multifamily apartment complexes and maybe some smaller mobile home parks or things. And it hasn't been at a lot of businesses. And now those have got to be added. And everything in your franchise collection agreements, and there are over 20 of those throughout the county, have to be aligned with 1383. We'd like them to be uniform, so our education message and our reporting are the same. And we'd like to introduce some current best practices in franchise agreements throughout all the jurisdictions. And so we'll need the cities ultimately to amend and negotiate those contracts, but we're going to help with that. We're issuing the term sheet. We're helping get your legal staff and your public works staff meeting and discussing that. And we're trying to get a big powwow in the next couple of weeks with those groups and your haulers and negotiate it all at one time. And so, for example, HCI is the facility, I believe, where your organics are going. They're creating compost and making electricity. And so that's the ultimate goal, is what we're trying to do. So the haulers need to provide us another big component is inspections and enforcement. And the haulers need to provide us with all their data basically every other month. and IWMA will inspect the services that are being provided, make sure it aligns with the state. We'll provide the education and we'll do the reporting. And if there's non-compliance, the cities ultimately are required to do enforcement, but IWMA is going to hope that that's not needed. We're going to try to educate people into compliance. And the state considers that a last resort as well. There's going to be several opportunities for people to get it right. Next is ordinances and policies. So there's going to be 7 new ordinances required by every jurisdiction, and some of them relate directly to providing the service and making sure it's being done properly. And they align completely with what we're trying to do with short-lived climate pollutants, but some of them go a little further. For example, there's one for your building codes, your C&D recycling, that's construction and demolition debris, has to be recycled at 65%. And you have to have water model efficient landscaping ordinance, again, which may not have to do with climate change, but it's in this bill. So there's 7 new ordinances have to be passed. And you know, it takes normally about a year to get any ordinance, and we got to do 7 in 9 months. We also have to have an edible food recovery program where we have to increase it by 20%. And so we've got approximately 300 larger restaurants or cafeteria type places, maybe at a hospital or a primary care facility, that need to make sure that they're not letting their edible food spoil. They're collecting it and paying a service to transport it to a food bank and make sure it goes back to edible food, human food consumption. And we do have to inspect that process and verify it, and we're still working on how's the best way to do that or inspect those businesses. Then organic waste procurement is on the cities. The cities basically have to buy back the material that's generated from the processing. And so most of your organics are going to HCI, and HCI creates compost. And so what we're going to recommend is in your franchise agreements that your haulers get back a portion of that material and provide probably a free giveaway in your jurisdiction. And that will cover a portion of it. We're going to try to get some of the electricity credit from HCI as they sell the electricity and put it on the grid. That's a renewable energy, but that's through that. We don't have a direct contract with them, so it's a little bit squirrely on getting that done. But IWMA is going to help you calculate how much you have to procure and then help you with the reporting on that, but it's got to be documented monthly and submitted annually. And then the cities also have to procure all their paper products have to be 30% recycled content, every type of paper. So we're going to have to help you do that as well. And then education and outreach, the haulers will provide us with the specific addresses of where they're providing all these services, but IWMA will do the actual education and help people understand how to do it, especially these new multifamilies that have never had organic service. You know, an apartment complex has pretty much just had a dumpster and then a recycling bin and nothing else. So we got to go door to door on that one. We'll also do the reporting and investigate complaints. And again, if there is enforcement needed, the cities will have to do that ultimately. And then the record keeping and reporting are quite extensive. We're going to have to add 2 people just to comply with this. But again, the haulers will provide the data on your behalf to IWMA, and we'll compile it, analyze it, and submit it on your behalf. So the implementation timeline is pretty tight here, but this is one of 5 pages of our Gantt chart. And so you can just see everything pretty much has to happen in 2021. And then you see another few boxes in 2023 because we're going to 50% diversion by 2021 or now, but we have to go to 75% by 2024. So there's another phase of implementation then, and a few other components kick in. So what are we doing? Last August, we started meeting with your public works staff, and we've gradually increased that to some of your legal team and your procurement folks, and having regular meetings with them to educate them on what's needed when. Again, the biggest hurdle first is to get your franchise agreements negotiated, so we're trying to work with everybody on that in the next few weeks. Your building department, we're going to educate them on the 65% C&D recycling rate, and your water department on the water efficient landscaping ordinance. We have hired a professional consultant who's very good at this. HF&H actually helped the state draft these regulations and help do the training statewide. So we're paying them. The board approved $330,000 contract with them, and the bulk of that money is to help you and the other cities negotiate your franchise amendments or make those changes, review your muni codes, and implement the ordinances. Only $80,000 is to help IWMA coordinate this. Like I mentioned, IWMA's got to add 3 full-time staff, and we're going to have a regular stable of interns from the schools. And then we will probably outsource through a consultant some of the education and inspection portions. We will need more funding for this. So what we're looking at right now, we charge 2% on the hauling fees. So if the hauler charges someone $100, we would get $2. And we're recommending right now it go up to 4% or $4. And we'd love for it to not take effect until 2022, but we may have to implement it sooner if we run out of money. We're trying to do those calculations. And capacity planning, like I said, we have to go to 75% by 2025. So we may need additional capacity for sure, or even new or additional facilities that will have to be built. We have to determine that. Our JPA will need to be amended to align with 1383. Currently, the state says it's not sufficient, so we'll probably have a brief one-page amendment to the current JPA, and that'll be in the next few months. But then a lot of things need to be updated and aligned with 1383 as a group, and that will probably be a bigger effort that we'll do in 2022 after the dust settles. So here's, again, the timeline. It's January 2022 there in the middle. In 2024, we've got to take some other precautions, and by 2025, we've got to have the 75% goal. So what we're asking you to do is stay engaged and ask a lot of questions. Like I said, we're getting your staff on board with this, and we've got a good consultant helping us coordinate this, and I'm sure Mr. Heller will keep you updated as well. But if you have any questions or comments, I'd be glad to take those now.
Thank you, Brooks, for the very comprehensive overview of SB 1383. Obviously, some major changes coming, and looks like to a good end. However, a significant cost burden associated with the implementation of that, which will both impact your operations, obviously, and our city operations and budget. But with that, I'm just going to go ahead and ask Councilmember Heller, did you have any comments that you wanted to add to what Brooks has stated?
Yeah, I would. And Brooks, I'd like to thank you for a very concise presentation. I think everyone can grasp the concept that this is a very heavy lift for the county. And Brooks and your organization, I appreciate your leadership very, very much. Question that I'll be asking at our meeting tomorrow, which I've been meaning to ask for quite some time, is there any money coming from Sacramento to support this change, or we have to bear the brunt of this ourselves?
Yeah, they are offering a few grants, but they're pretty much going to the jurisdictions that need to build a processing facility like HCI. There's about 100 of those needed statewide to comply with this.
Okay,
and
so
100 more of those. So we're probably not going to get any, is the short answer.
Okay, can you explain to everybody what HCI is?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you.
That's all right.
So HCI is an anaerobic digester. So it's basically just a really long metal tube that they put your food waste and your green waste into at one end, and it just kind of mashes it up. There's some articulated, I don't know what they're called, but they're big metal bars in there that move back and forth and mix it as it goes through. And I think it's about 3 weeks it's in that process, and it comes out the other end as compost. And so it can take paper, it can take your grass clippings, your yard waste, food waste, chicken bones, eggshells, meat, whatever. You just throw it in there and it will come out compost at the other end in 3 weeks. They let it cure for a couple weeks after that and dry, but then you can basically land apply it, and it's a good soil amendment. And in the process, they make electricity, and they sell that. I believe it powers several hundred homes locally. But many of the haulers, are probably a larger portion of the material in the county, is going to HCI. We do not have the direct contract with them. They're run through Waste Connections, which I believe does your service. So your material is going there. North County has a couple of other options that are using advanced composting systems and not this type of AD facility, but they're in compliance as well.
Okay. That's the only question. I want to make sure everyone has time to ask questions in the group here, because I'll be seeing Brooks and others tomorrow.
Good, thanks, Jeff. Any other council member questions for Brooks or Councilmember Hiller?
I'd like to ask a question. It's pretty basic, Brooks, but it came up this week at my house, and the question was, after making big smoothies or something, what the heck do you do with the remains? And so we figured out that it needed to go in the green can, but is it going to be okay to use like a paper bag or something like that to at least hold on to it during the week while you're waiting for the truck to come?
Well, we're working on that. I'm sorry I'm going to get into the detail here, but it's a little bit sticky. As I understand it, HCI, their facility, and the operators are saying paper is fine, but we need to educate people that it can't be the wax coated or the aseptic containers like a milk carton that has that coating on it. And so we want to make sure Waste Connections is on board with that idea, and HCI is in alignment with that, and then we can roll out the education campaign, because we don't want those other kinds of papers in there that would be contaminants, and then it would make a dirty product at the end. Right now, it's extremely clean, and they're very happy with what's coming in there. The contamination rate is less than 1%, and so we just need to be very delicate with how we approach that.
Great, thank you. Sounds like we made the right choice.
Indeed. Other council questions? Hearing none, Councilmember Heller is always available for updates, and we do appreciate that, Jeff. And unfortunately, good, I think, project and or good. Sorry about that. Good improvement in how we treat our waste. Unfortunately, though, another unfunded mandate, and we'll all be dealing with that, I'm sure, across our jurisdictions as this gets implemented. Brooks, thanks again so much for being here. We appreciate that and your leadership, and we'll have you back soon, hopefully.
Okay, thank you very much. Have a good meeting.
Have a great night. Thank you. All right, with that, we will go ahead and move to general public comment. This is public comment for items that are on the agenda for which you don't have time to stay around for and make comments then, or any other general comments concerning the city that you'd like to make. In order to prevent and mitigate the effects of COVID-19 pandemic and to limit the potential spread, we're not making available a physical location for providing public input, but on the screen you will notice a couple of ways to access public comment. One is via our Zoom link. Please don't forget to use the raise hand feature if you'd like to speak, and or you may call in by telephone as noted on the screen, and be sure to press *9 to raise your hand, and you'll be recognized by Anthony to provide public comment. So with that, again, this is general public comment for items that are on the agenda for which you can't stay and you'd like to speak to, and or items that are not on the agenda that you generally like to raise regarding the city. And you will have 3 minutes. And Anthony, first public comment, please.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Ruth Ann Angus, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Okay, Ruth, you are unmuted.
Welcome, Ruth Ann.
Ruth Ann, I have unmuted you.
I'm unmuted, yes?
Yes.
There I am. Welcome, Ruth Ann.
I had to click the button. Hi to everybody. It's Ruth Ann Angus. I'm with Yes We Can Peace Builders, and I believe you have something on the agenda this evening having to do with guns and gun control, etc. So I'd like to ask our city council to consider making a public statement and a public request to the Congress to ban the sale of assault weapons to the public. These weapons that should only be in the hands of the military and the police apparently are being sold to the public. And since we seem to have reverted sadly back to quote unquote normal with an increase in gun violence, and because Morro Bay is listed as a member of the National Nonviolent Cities Project, I feel it is appropriate for us to support any upcoming legislation that would control gun violence in this country. And that's about all I have to say. I'm hoping that you will consider that. Thank you for the opportunity for me to make this request.
Thank you, Ruth Ann. Anthony, next public comment, please.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I have Andrea.
Welcome, Andrea.
Andrea, I went ahead and unmuted you.
Welcome, Andrea. Can you hear us?
Andrea, I'm going to try to pronounce your last name. Shemalik, maybe? I have unmuted you, and you are free to speak. Mayor, why don't I go ahead to the next name?
That'd be fine, and we'll come back if we can get Andrea in. That would be great. Thank you.
Sounds good. Yes, I have Michelle Garner as the next attendee. Okay, Michelle, I have unmuted you.
Welcome, Michelle. Oh my, we're 1 for 3 here.
Yeah,
Mayor, I am hearing from people that they are talking and that we're not able to hear them.
I'm unmuted now. This is Michelle. Can you hear me now?
Oh, Michelle, welcome.
Apparently, it pops up. It looks like it pops up a little dialogue box that maybe people are missing that says the host is asking you to unmute.
Thank you.
I found it.
Appreciate it.
Yes.
Okay, so should I start?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Well, my name's Michelle Garner, and I'm the lead for the San Luis Obispo County chapter of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. We're a grassroots movement nationwide of volunteers that are working to reduce gun deaths in all their forms in our country. And I just want to voice support for your city doing whatever they can to just proactively address the potential for gun violence in our community. And I care really deeply about this issue because I'm a mom of 2 kids in our public schools, and I'm a wife to one of our public school teachers here, and I worry about them coming home every day. And I care about it because I know that on average 100 Americans every single day are killed by guns, whether that's homicide, suicide, or unintentional shootings. And I wonder if one of us will be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I also care about this issue because I have personally lost family members to suicide by gun. And so I know all too well that this can and does happen in every family and every community. We know through research that laws, policy, and public campaigns really do work, and I'm glad you're considering pursuing those safe storage ordinances and public awareness campaigns. And safe storage is critical because in almost every school shooting to date, shooter obtained their firearm from their own home or that of a family member or friend. And this would not have been possible if those firearms had been properly stored. Safe storage also prevents teens and kids from unintentionally shooting themselves or others. It can prevent suicide in that even a momentary interruption in access to firearms can be enough for someone to change their mind about their suicide attempt. And public education campaigns about our California Red Flag Law, also known as a gun violence restraining order, are critically important as well and easy to implement. And we're so lucky to have this law in California, but it only works if people know about it and can speak up to prevent someone who may be a danger to themselves or others from hurting someone. And then finally, I just want to leave you with a reminder that Sandy Hook, Gilroy, Sutherland Springs, and thousands of small towns across America were just like ours. They were idyllic and peaceful and quiet until one day they weren't. And now they're known for gun-related tragedies that happened there. So I support you, and I hope that you'll do everything in your power at the city level to ensure we're never added to the list of names. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Anthony, next public comment, please.
Yes, Mayor, thank you. I do see a phone-in caller, last three numbers ending 327, 805 ending in 327. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Okay, you are unmuted.
Welcome. Perhaps, Anthony, you could repeat the suggestion of the last caller that folks need to press.
Yeah, there's a pop-up window. If you are calling in, I believe it is *9 to unmute yourself. And still do not see that open yet. So I'm going to go to the next raised hand I see, Mayor, if that's okay. And
that's fine.
That's Betty Windholz.
Great. Welcome, Betty.
Thank you. This is Betty Winholtz. Just two topics. One is a follow-up from the last meeting regarding tree trimming during nesting season on private property, that continues to happen. And I've tried to look on the city's website to see where that's been announced that this is nesting season and we should not be cutting trees, either public or private at this time. And I'm wondering if it will be going in the next water bill and how you are getting the word out, because people don't know that they can't do this kind of work right now. And I know that part of this is related to the tree cutters or the tree trimmers, that it seems to be a particular business that's involved with this and they know better. So I'm wondering what kind of consequence there is for that as well. So again, looking out for the birds and the trees and protecting this season. My second question or topic has to do with the new sewer. And I noticed that there's been work continuously done on Quintana, and then it seemed to shut down right before last weekend. I'm wondering if you can tell us what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. Appreciate that. Anthony, next public comment, please.
All right. Let's see. I'm just going to let the person know that the phone number ending in 327. It is *6 to unmute yourself. If I can give you another chance to do that here, I'm going to go ahead and try to unmute. Okay. Now you should be live, phone-in caller.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is Dan Sedney calling.
Welcome, Dan.
Mr. Mayor, in regards to your opening statements and advisement on COVID, which is always appreciated, of course, I may be mistaken, but I thought I had heard that Governor Newsom had ordered that on some date that we would be completely opening, some date soon, and doing away with the color coding. Yet I have not heard you comment about when this will happen, and as that pertains to when our city council meetings would return to normal if our governor has announced a complete reopening and doing away with the color code systems. Second, I completely object to city council members using their comment periods for their forums for national agendas. Further, I completely object to their using their public speaking time for forums for political parties. I find this objectionable and not in the best interest of Morro Bay. Our concerns should be related to Morro Bay and not the national interest. And that's my opinion. Lastly, I'd like to address the lady that talked about weapons of war. It's right now illegal to purchase weapons of war in the United States. I don't know that she knows that. I don't know if she knows what a weapon of war truly is, but you cannot buy one in the United States, let alone possess one. And those are my comments. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Dan. Anthony, next public comment, please.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I'm going to go ahead and unmute Andrea. I would try to say your last name, but I'm just going to go ahead and keep with your first name. It looks like it's difficult for me to pronounce. So I'll stay with Andrea. I'm go ahead and unmuting you, Andrea. There you go. You are unmuted.
Andrea, I believe it's *6 to unmute yourself.
She's not on an actual, I think, cell phone. If she is, it is *6 definitely. But it appears that she may be from a computer, and she should be unmuted right now. That's what I'm seeing, Mayor.
Okay.
Andrea, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Welcome.
Wonderful. Okay, I was struggling with the output here, but I'm glad that you can hear me now. Thank you so much for your patience.
No problem.
I am here today to read a public comment on behalf of Morro Bay resident Jen Ford, who is unable to attend today. Dear Mayor Heading and Morro Bay City Council members, I'm writing to you in regards to Agenda Item C2, Local Firearm Safety and Regulation. As a Morro Bay resident, I plead for the city to take action to create a safer community in all ways possible within your control. My life experience with gun safety and violence started early. At the age of 10, my best friend's brother found a gun in his parents' bedroom, shot himself in the head, and died in my friend's arms. Fast forward to my high school days, as I had to duck and cover on the tennis courts when a drive-by shooting took place next door at the Burger Hangout. Not long after that, I had to shelter in place while shots were fired into the crowd at a local shopping mall. 5 years later, my sister was forced to the ground with a gun to her head while robbed at work. Weeks later, my mother had a man brandish a gun during a road raging incident. With this history of gun violence in my hometown of Bakersfield, my husband and I wanted a safer life for our children, so we moved to Morro Bay. For the most part, life has been less stressful on the Central Coast. Having said this, unfortunately, my daughter and I have been victims of death threats in the last few years due to our local activism. So I ask this question, is there ever a safe place to raise a family? I'm sure that the residents of Parkland, Columbine, Newton, etc. felt safe before tragedy struck. I hope that cities of all sizes start addressing this ongoing issue. Easier access to mental health is also an important issue, but it needs to be paired with improved firearms regulations. Over my lifetime, I've lost 5 friends from ages 16 to 85 years to suicide, where their lives ended with a gunshot. We must do what we can to protect our families, friends, coworkers, neighbors, and visitors. It begins here and now. Please do all that you can. We need our leaders to act. Thank you for addressing this issue. Sincerely, Jen Ford, Morro Bay resident. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Anthony, next public comment, please.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I'm going to go ahead and unmute Caitlin Cox. Okay, Caitlin, you are unmuted.
Welcome, Caitlin.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm a district representative for Congressman Carvajal, and he asked me to read a statement on item C2 from him. Preventing gun violence is a deeply personal issue for me. My older sister took her own life with a gun when we were growing up together in Arizona. Across the nation, more than 36,000 Americans are killed by guns every year, and 22,000 of those gun deaths, about 61%, are suicides. Too many families have felt the pain of losing a loved one to gun violence, including mine, and I will not stop fighting for pragmatic policies to prevent gun violence and save lives. There are common sense solutions that can be implemented at all levels of our government to curb this violent trend. It is vital that we give our law enforcement the right tools to address dangerous behaviors and save lives. California enacted a red flag law to temporarily disarm individuals in crisis in order to do just that, in working to expand this successful policy to more states across the country. No one policy will be the cure-all, so I have also advocated for expanded background checks and measures to prevent individuals with troubling histories of violence from acquiring a firearm. Finally, Congress must act to ensure all gun transactions are safe and legal and we should promote responsible gun ownership through safety training and education on secure storage. I believe we can protect our communities from this senseless violence while also respecting the Second Amendment rights of gun owners. As lawmakers, we have a responsibility to honor the victims and survivors of gun violence with action. There is no single solution to end the gun violence epidemic in America, but that is no reason not to try and pass legislation that will save lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Anthony, next public comment, please.
Yes, Mayor, thank you. I do not see any raised hands left in the queue.
All right. Thank you so much for that. And with that, I will go ahead and close general public comment, bring it back to council. First, let me ask Mr. Collins who he would like to have address Ms. Weinholz's questions regarding tree trimming on private property during the nesting season, and have we notified the public on our website, or are we going to through our water bill? What is there a plan? So
I can post that to the website. Sorry, missed that one. I don't know if there's plans to send out through the water bill or not. We usually reserve those for major things, but certainly something we can consider. And then related to the wharf project, all systems go on the pipeline project. Just checking in with Rob on that. But I'll let Scott speak to if there's any consequences for any one particular vendor violating the that's the bird issue. So go ahead, Scott. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, like for most things, we usually when we receive complaints, and we had one that happened today, and Ms. Winholt was involved, and she's the one that called me actually. We usually make contact, with the offending party and provide education. So that's normally, how that starts. And if we were to continue to get repeat offenders, that type of thing, then there's the possibility of issuing citations. So that's how we deal with the code enforcement aspect of trimming trees during bird nesting season.
Great. Any comment, Mr. Collins, on the question about Quintana work? Any update? I don't know if Kyle's here, but
work is ongoing in both sections now of Quintana, it sounds like. So we had some delays because of State Historic Preservation Office issues, but that's all been resolved. So just checking in, it seems like all systems go in two sections of the Quintana pipeline project.
Okay, thanks for that. And then if we could get maybe Chris, I have not specifically heard when or if the governor is going to lift the meeting ban. I certainly haven't heard of any lifting of the current tiered system in California, but do you have a legal update for us on potentially anything that I may have missed?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. The governor actually announced that the state aspires to, in June, to, quote, reopen the economy, I believe, end quote. I believe it's set a target date of June 15th, predicated on there being a sufficient supply of vaccines and that hospitalizations are low. If the good news continues with both hospitalizations staying low and vaccines continuing to roll out, the governor basically said that in mid-June, he would like to eliminate the color coding system. In regards to the state of emergency that was declared in March of 2020, from at least what I've reviewed in the Sacramento Bee, the governor has not said if and when he's going to be revising that or rescinding it. Obviously, there is, an end date for this, but I'm not aware of the general restrictions having a hard end date. But of course, there's a lot of optimism in the state that in a few months, generally the economy will start up again, and with common sense risk reduction, a lot of normal activities can return. As for specifically opening up Veterans Hall and when the city would go back to meetings like they were before the COVID-19 pandemic, I don't know when that would occur. As long as the state of emergency is in place, as it currently is, cities are able to hold meetings through teleconferencing like that is occurring right now. And I don't know when that will be lifted. I'm sure at some point it will, though.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that update. With that, That brings us to item A on our agenda this evening. This is the consent agenda. I'll go ahead and open up public comment for items on the consent agenda. This is item A1 through A6. If you'd like to speak to those items now, this would be the appropriate time. So public comment is open. And Anthony, do we have anybody in the queue, sir?
Yes, Mayor. Thank you. I have Betty Windholtz. Okay, Betty, I've unmuted you.
Thank you. This is Betty Windholtz again. I would just like to speak to A6, please. And I appreciate comments answering the questions in the correspondence that was published on the website. I just have a couple of follow-up if you could clarify for me some of the answers. One of them is, could you clarify that the $100,000 that's left over from the original study, that original paragraph that Mr. Leivik spoke to, is that what we're using for this to finish up this study on? Number two, could you just affirm that then the application has not been made to the city yet, and since Caltrans is following the NEPA process and the city is following the CEQA process, are we doing parallel projects, or will it ultimately come to one project when it comes before the city planning commission? And then my last question is, could you clarify, or if we know when the low-income housing project is planned for starting construction? You mentioned that the hotel will probably start construction before the roundabout. Will that also be true for the low-income housing, or maybe we don't even know what their time schedule is? And for sure, will this not overlap with the sewer project? Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. Anthony, next public comment, please.
Thank you, Mayor. I do not see any raised hands left in the queue.
Okay, with that, I'll go ahead then and close public comment for the consent agenda, bring it back to council. I'll go ahead and pull A6 so that we can answer Ms. Weinholz's question, or questions, I should say. And are there any other items to pull, council members? If not, I'll entertain a motion for A1 through A5.
I'll move to approve A1 through A5.
Second.
Motion by Councilmember Addis to approve consent items A1 through A5, second by Councilmember Davis. Any further discussion on that? Hearing none, roll call vote, please.
Councilmember Addis?
Yes.
Councilmember Barton?
Yes.
Councilmember Davis?
Yes.
Councilmember Heller?
Yes.
And Mayor Heading?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. And I went ahead and pulled A6, and perhaps if Mr. Leivik is present, can ask him to address the 4 issues that Betty raised, including the leftover $100,000. Is that to be used to finish the study? The issue regarding the application having not been made to the city, her question about parallel projects, and lastly about the low-income housing project start date. So, Rob.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, City Council. The $100,000 is still within the budget for the capital budget for the project, so it will be used in addition to other funds to complete the preliminary engineering for this project. So it's we're in the PAED fees, the project authorization, environmental determination phase, and we'll move on to preliminary engineering once this is complete. So yes, that $100,000 is still within the budget. Regarding city application, once GHD's subcontractor, SWCA, has completed their draft work, we'll be submitting application to the city for the coastal development permit and CEQA determination. So I see that coming in the next 6 to 9 months or so when we get that completed. They have some additional archaeological work. That's what this amendment is for, is to complete some field work that is required. The project is going through two environmental reviews. So CEQA, the state's environmental review, and then also because federal funds are involved in this project, we have CMANC, or the air quality funds that are contributing to the preliminary engineering. It does need to go through the federal process, the NEPA process, and Caltrans is lead agency on that. These are two separate processes. Caltrans will take action on the NEPA process, and the city planning commission will make recommendations to the city council on the coastal development permit and the CEQA determination. As for timing of the low-income housing project, I might have to ask a friend, Mr. Graham, if he has any information on that. I don't believe it's completely funded yet, and it may be a while before they commence their work.
That's actually correct, Rob. They are still working on their funding. It's a tax credit project, and so they've submitted for the latest round of tax credit financing. So I think their application's in. I don't think they've heard back yet. They are in plan check, and we just received their second round of plans in response to our comments. So I don't have any timeline for when they intend to start. A lot of that's going to be predicated again on the funding and their ability to get through plan checks. So I think they're a little ways out right now until they get the funding squared away for the project.
Great, thanks, Rob and Scott. Appreciate that. Council, any other? I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Oh, great, thank you. I'll go ahead and move approval of A6.
Second.
Motion by Mayor Heading for approval of A6, second by Councilmember Davis. And any other comments regarding A6?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I have a question I'd like to ask.
Absolutely.
A timeline. What are we looking at for the Caltrans project? Do we have any idea when that is planned to approximately start and be completed?
So Caltrans is working with us on the environmental document. So we need to complete that work by April of next year to continue to move this project forward. So we're working on them. Once we've completed the PA and ED phase, we'll move on to the design engineering phase of that. The project is funded through the design phase. Then we'll need to really roll up our sleeves and be able to deliver the construction project. It does require some additional funding to bring this project forward.
And do we know about how much funding we'll need, Rob, beyond what we have in place?
About $4.1 million.
And what would be the potential source of funding for it?
I believe we're looking towards the reauthorization of the surface transportation bill, and earmarks is our current method of bridging that funding gap.
So it looks like we're talking about 2022 or 23? Or
23, probably fiscal year 2022, 23, near the end of that fiscal year is when we would anticipate construction to start. Probably at least 18 months construction period on the project.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. That's all I have, Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember Heller. Any other comments or questions on item A6? If not, I'll go ahead and ask for a roll call vote, please.
Councilmember Addis?
Yes.
Councilmember Barton?
Yes.
Councilmember Davis?
Yes.
Councilmember Heller?
Yes.
And Mayor Heading?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. That completes our consent agenda. We have no public hearings this evening, so I'll move us to item C-1. This is our first business item. This is seeking direction from the City Council regarding the principles for use of the local voter-approved transaction and use taxes, commonly known as Measure Q and Measure E, and to authorize the city manager to use the aforementioned principles in proposing uses for the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 proceeds that the city hopefully will be receiving, and also consider potential capital projects to submit for federal earmark funding. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Lichtig and our city manager, Mr. Collins. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor and council members, members of the public. I'm just going to do a quick introduction for this item. We are in a very interesting time, somewhat of a new place for Morro Bay, you know, where we were last year, where it was very dire situation, especially when we were March, April timeframe. No visitors, our economy essentially shut down, and we were contemplating some pretty drastic measures. Fast forward to where we are now, we're starting to see recovery, and we have a federal government that actually supports local governments, supports cities, providing direct funding to help prop us up, and potentially go further with investments in infrastructure that we haven't seen in a generation or two. So we want to make sure we're positioned effectively to take on those funds and be competitive as possible for some of those other federal funds in the earmark process. Furthermore, I want to thank the community members who supported Measure E20 that provides us the ability to continue to provide top-level service to our community in terms of public safety, infrastructure, and the like, and keeping our community clean. I really appreciate the work of Katie Lichtig, our interim finance director, as well as Sandy Martin, who've helped lead this effort to bring forward a different approach, not too unlike what's come before, but a slightly different approach to Measure EQ funding and how those funds are used. I want to thank several members of the Citizen Finance Advisory Committee who provided advice and guidance and thoughts to Katie and Sandy through this process. And we believe this will allow us to fulfill the missions that are included in Measure Q and Measure E. And furthermore, those will help inform decisions made with regard to the Rescue Act, as well as how we position ourselves with earmark opportunities in the federal government. So with that, I'll turn it over to Katie, and thank you for your work, Katie.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate the shout out and appreciate your guidance in this whole process. I'm going to share my screen in order to share the PowerPoint. It's slightly revised from the PowerPoint that I sent about 15 minutes before the council meeting. So just wanted to let everybody know that on the council that the revised is what will be up on the screen for you. The principles that are presented here are based on the passage of Measure E and wanting to have a cohesive and comprehensive approach to the allocations of those funds. As many know, this has been a lifeline thrown to the city in terms of being able to fund the most important services and programs for the city. And so let me just jump right into the presentation. So the principles are based on the reality that we want to do two things at the same time. And given the feedback and opportunities to discuss, I'm going to present to the council some revised recommendations at the end of the presentation based on the historical knowledge that I've gained since I published or we published the staff report. And so what's reflected here is the original recommendation, and then I'll go into some details about why I'm suggesting some changes to this. But as you know, many of the measures are meant to maintain the highest priority services, public safety, cleanliness, and infrastructure. And so those three main categories have been captured. The definitions of those are slightly more expansive than they have historically been, but with the addition of about $2.2 million of revenues, that gives us an opportunity to reevaluate what is defined within the scope of those priorities. And so as you can see here, these are the principles, and then the next slide will go over the streamlining processes that I've recommended, and again, have gotten some feedback and will present some additional thoughts about council consideration. One particular area, or the first one on here, is to maintain public safety services. And That includes the fire department, the police department, and the Morro Bay Harbor Department, both including personnel, equipment, as well as support services, in addition to the fire headquarters debt service and the fire engine loan repayment that is being made to the general fund emergency reserve that helped to save some money along the way. As you know, we've used quite a bit of the general fund emergency reserve, and so in this totality of packages, we're going to be proposing both to the council and to the CFAC, the Citizens Finance Advisory Committee, replenishing the GFER, as it's commonly referred to, but that is predominantly going to come out of the American Rescue Plan. I've been around so long that there have been enough Recovery Acts and Rescue Acts, and that I sometimes get the acronyms incorrect. So this is the Rescue Plan that I'm talking about tonight. We'd also propose to maintain and enhance the cleanliness of the city of Morro Bay, the parks, the waterfront, and the beaches by funding personnel, supplies, operating expenses, and equipment to support those operations that would lend itself to achieving that outcome. And that would include in departments of Public Works, Consolidated Maintenance, and in the Harbor Department. We propose to have one of the principles highlight investing in infrastructure and equipment, such as street paving, storm drains, vehicle replacements to support city services. And again, this may include increasing our capacity to actually get the projects done. That means that we really want to put some dollars behind being able to put those projects out to bid, get them finished, and move on to the next investment in our capital infrastructure. And then lastly, to ensure the city's financial health by maintaining appropriate reserve levels to respond to economic downturns, natural disasters, and our health emergencies, as well as any unforeseen challenges or opportunities. Again, nobody anticipated the health emergency that we've endured the last year. And so we want to be prepared not only for those things that we might otherwise wish weren't going to happen, but we should anticipate happening. Things like floods and mudslides and earthquakes and other human-made disasters, potentially, God forbid, a terrorist attack, a tsunami. Sorry to name all of the horribles that could happen, but there are unforeseen challenges that we might face, but there are also opportunities that we might face that would really lend itself towards reinvesting in the community, in economic development, in really making the community exactly what we want it to be. And so we want to make sure that there's sufficient opportunities to use the funds flexibly, and that's in many ways what the community asked for or was asked to approve when the Measure E went before them last November. Measure Q and Measure E are really general use taxes, and they can be used on any purpose. We've gotten general guidance from the community, and in those educational opportunities, the city has highlighted the opportunities for additional expenditures or areas where we've deferred maintenance that should be invested in. But again, there is no special taxing responsibility associated with Measure Q and Measure E. And so we're trying to put a framework around where the money should be focused, and then also giving a little bit of flexibility to potential opportunities that we just don't know exist today. As it relates to the streamlining opportunities, instead of having bullets, as is in the staff report, I numbered these so that it would be easier to refer to during the discussion. Basically, what we're trying to do is mirror the ordinance that was adopted as it related to the measure. And so these funds would go into a fund and would be accounted for as a source of revenue. And that's exactly what the ordinance anticipated would happen. And then it would, in this particular case, what was proposed was to simplify the accounting for those dollars. As you'll see as I move through the presentation, I've rethought those considerations with getting some historical perspective with some CFAC members, as well as with staff. And so I'm going to be making a proposal to change my recommendation to you, but this was originally what we had anticipated presenting to the council for your adoption. And so it would create transparency in the general fund to create a total cost of providing those services and programs. The trade-off there was providing transparency and accountability, not in the fact that the dollars would get spent, but they wouldn't be accounted for and reported in exactly the same way that they're being reported on now. And that's why I'm making the change in my proposal to you, is that trade-off in retrospect didn't seem to be as well thought out and well received as I thought that it might otherwise would have. And so in thinking about it, it just felt like went a little bit too far, too fast. And so as the city gets a little bit of experience behind it, it may decide to go in this direction, or it may decide to stay exactly as the council adopts. Just as it relates to the American Rescue Plan, ARP, these are the eligible expenditures that were articulated in a National League of Cities webinar that I attended. It is available for anybody to view on the National League of Cities website. This happened to be one of the weekly, semi-weekly, as-needed weekly webinars from the National League of Cities that's been in cooperation with the California League of Cities, that outlined by Gene Sperling, who is the special advisor to the president, who's actually coordinating the implementation with Treasury of the guidance that is going to be provided. From a timing perspective, unfortunately, on May 12th, because that's the day after we publish our budget. So we're going to go with the knowledge that we have. We've been working with our public affairs consultants in Washington to try to get some additional clarification on what these expenditure guidelines will say in actuality. Mr. Sperling is actually coordinating across every department, and there's many, many parts of the American Rescue Plan that are applicable to the city. This is just the one program that will come directly to the city. 1.98 million is the initial estimate on what will be coming. Again, Treasury is redoing those dollars because some cities were left out of the original. Some cities should have gotten less. Some territories and tribal agencies revisions needed to be made in terms of their allocations. So again, we're going to program what we know right now, which was based on the committee staff's estimation of 1.98. It's coming in 2 tranches. So we'll be proposing the use of the first tranche with the budget that we proposed to the city council. And again, we'll do it based on the best available information that we have when we go to print just before the 11th. It'll be the week before the 11th. And when I say print, I just don't want anybody to get scared that we're going to be using a lot of paper. We do print it online as a PDF, but there's a lot of work that goes into actually producing the document. And so I probably, instead of saying going to print, I should say going to production of the document, because at some point we just have to plant the flag and say, okay, no more changes. We got to go and produce a document that is available to the council and the community. I did want to point out one particular item, which is number C, or item C on this list, and it says eligible expenditures for the provision of government services to the extent of the reduction in revenue of such a government, which is the city, relative to the revenues collected in the most recent fiscal year of the city prior to the emergency. So the full year prior to the emergency was 2018-19, not 19-20, because we were impacted in 19-20 from a revenue perspective. And so we're going to be proposing not only the services, but also the restoration of some of the general fund emergency reserves that were lost as a result of the emergency. This is a pretty interesting advice slide that comes from the National League of Cities. We should be using dedicated grants and programs first whenever possible. And so there are other programs out there that are moving their way through the process of getting the regulations done. There's other legislation that's out there that can be related to transportation or housing or some of the other needs. And so really the message was stay on top of all the possible alternative dollars. Really understand your operations and your needs, prioritize fiscal sustainability and stability and returning to work, save the pet projects, and I would call them not pet projects, I would call them community priorities, but specialized community priorities that aren't necessarily related to the emergency for earmarks, and City Manager Collins will be talking a little bit about that. Maintain our records and documentation. I want to tell you that the city's done an excellent job of creating the documentation and the record keeping processes, because many of us, and my experience is that other jurisdictions that I've worked for have had federally declared disasters that didn't conclude until 20 years after the actual event. And so many of the people won't be here that long. Maybe, hopefully, a lot of people will, but you just have to create continuity across the changes in staffs. And then we want to share our successes with our congressional representatives. And so we've had a great working relationship with Congressman Carvajal's office, and we'll continue to do that. And we will make sure that when there's ribbon cuttings to be had, or grand openings, or bicycle rides on new bike trails, or whatever the case may be, that we will make sure that the appropriate public relations and notifications go out, and the invitations go to our local congressional delegations as well. So I'm going to just review the recommendations for you. These are the representations of the suggested changes that I'm making for the council to consider. I understand, oops, sorry about that. That my inclusion of the may include but aren't limited to has created some concern that something nefarious or untoward might happen sometime in the future. This was just to be inclusive of things that we might not consider to be public safety issues today that may need dollars that aren't necessarily associated with those three departments. So I think that instead of creating concern, we should just eliminate that phrase in those two items. And so that is my revised recommendation. In the streamlining process, again, there was concern about creating more transparency on the departmental side, but less transparency and oversight capacity on the measure Q and E side. And so the main difference here is in number 4 and the elimination, obviously, of number 5 and 6. And number 4 now reads, budget and actual transactions for all personnel and equipment will be budgeted for and posted in the measure Q and E fund, which is fund number 003. Capital projects will be accounted for in the general fund capital fund number 915. with transfers out of the Measure Q and E fund at year end based on actual expenditures. And again, that's very similar to what's happening today, but this clarifies that we won't just be doing transfers out of the Measure Q and E fund into the general fund and having all the expenditures happen in the general fund. So this creates much of the same system that is currently in effect. It does likely streamline some of the accounting and transactional overhead that's associated with tracking these costs and expenditures, because when we implement the principles, we are asking the departments to propose maintaining and enhancing their capability to provide the services through larger expenditures, and those larger expenditures will likely come in the form of personnel that are providing those services. So instead of coming to measure the CFAC and the council and asking for the $10,000 here and the $25,000 there, those costs will be absorbed or considered as part of the general fund, because we've allocated funds from Measure Q and Measure E from the Measure Q, Measure E to cover the personnel that will be providing those services. So hopefully that'll be perfectly clear when you get to see the proposed budget on May 11th. The other recommendations is to authorize the city manager to present proposed uses of the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, the ARP, consistent with the revised Measure Q, Measure E principles and the guidance issued by the Department of Treasury when that becomes available, and also to provide input to the city staff regarding federal earmarks. And at this point, I think I'm going to ask Scott to just review with the council the work that's being done by a variety of staff members with the Congressman's office, as well as the public affairs consultant, to identify those potential opportunities.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. And I won't try to summarize all the various funding mechanisms. There's too many to list and confusing acronyms. So suffice to say that we are in constant contact with Congressman Carvajal's office to ensure that we are positioning ourselves well on several fronts for federal earmark or transportation funding. We're looking at 3 projects, we believe, in consultation with the Ferguson Group, our federal lobbyist, that will position us well. One thing to keep in mind is each congressional member is being asked to propose projects for their entire districts. So each of the cities within each of those congressional districts are competing for the same funds. And each Congress member is going to carry forward their top priorities. So we're competing within our own region and against other cities in the entire country. So we have to be very mindful of that. So we're looking at projects that may set us apart. We did hear earlier this evening about the State Road 1 and 41 improvements. We think that's a good project to put forward. Our SLOCOG supports the project, and they have put forward funding for that. So there is some competitive nature of, because we've already have funding associated with that that's non-federal. The other projects we're looking at this time are the North T Pier. We know how much need there is in our waterfront and harbor area. North T Pier needs to be replaced, not immediately, but rather soon. And there is a connection with the U.S. Coast Guard facility that probably positions us well compared to other cities, the uniqueness factor. And then the last project we're considering is a water resiliency package of the indirect potable reuse component of the wharf project and the Nutmeg tank replacement project, both kind of work in concert. One is creating a water source, and the other is storing said water source for when we need that water. And as we understand, we're heading into what can be a prolonged drought that will be kind of an issue across the board, especially in the western half of the United States. So we believe that having projects are either already shovel on ground or near that point will position us well. So those are 3 projects we're going to be submitting to Carvajal's office, and then sort of see where the chips may fall. But certainly helpful to have SLOCOG supporting one of those projects, and also talking closely with Greg Haas and Carvajal's office. We think these are putting our best foot forward. So that's how we're going to approach that. So I can take any questions once we get to the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. I just want to finish up on the presentation. This is the slide that I neglected to include in the original version that I sent the council and the staff. We had asked 3 key questions of the council for tonight's consideration. One is, does the council support the proposed Measure E and Measure Q principles? Do you support this? And that includes the revisions of the streamlining or the processes that we would use to account for the Measure E and Measure Q expenditures. Do you also support using the same principles for the usage of the American Rescue Plan money? And then do you have any input regarding the potential federal earmarks? And so that concludes the staff presentation. We're available to answer questions, and then when the time comes, I'm happy to put up the revised recommendations again. So on that note, I'll stop sharing and turn it back over to the mayor and the council.
Thank you, Katie and Scott, very much for your comprehensive presentation on a rather complex issue involving multiple moving parts, measures Q and E, and the expenditure guidelines that you're proposing for that with the recommended changes as noted. And I did take notes, Katie, on that, so I think I've got that down. And then the authorization for the American Rescue Plan Act funding, which could total as much as $1.98 million for the city. And then also input on the return of earmarks to the city, or not to the city, but from the federal government, hopefully to the city, and the projects that Mr. Collins has outlined. And so I'll operate from your last slide, which are really the key questions you're asking council. But first, as usual, I'm going to open it up to council members for any direct questions of staff. And let's, this evening, if we could start with Council Member Addis. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Mayor. I really don't have any questions. I have a couple of comments. That's it.
Thanks. Appreciate that. Councilmember Heller, sir, any questions?
Yes, I do. We have some agenda correspondence regarding the streamlining issue. And just reading from it, it says that Measure Q specifically was not to be spent on funding salaries or wages long-term, nor was it to maintain a reserve or emergency fund. It was specifically for infrastructure and equipment. How do you answer this concern of the public?
Well, and I'll give it a shot, and then obviously the city manager may have some ideas similar or different than mine. Two things. One is conditions change over time. It was a general tax. It was never specifically prohibited to be spent on certain things. And it was certainly intended at the time to address some capital needs. And historically, it has not been spent on personnel. But in talking to some of the members of CFAC and some of the folks who have had a long tenure on these issues, they recognize that times change, and the Measure E, which is 2/3 of the amount that is going to be collected, doesn't have the same language in the measure, and so ultimately it's going to be about a mix and balance. It's not all going to go towards personnel. It's not all going to go towards infrastructure, but there will be a balance, and ultimately the council gets to make the policy decision about whether that balance is the correct one.
Yeah, I'll just add that, I can't speak to what occurred in 2006, but, in recent years, Measure Q has been used to help fund the fire department's, in essence, the 12th position, through overtime and other things like that. So that's going directly into, personnel costs. Ultimately, people are what deliver the services to our community. The community wanted enhanced fire safety, public safety. That was a key consideration for Measure Q, and that was a key consideration for Measure E. So we want to make sure we do that and balance it with the needs to ensure that our infrastructure is sound moving forward. So what's being proposed allows for both. I mean, really, it's trying to gear it towards what we heard from our community in 2019 as their highest priorities. So I hope that helps. And Chief Knuckles can give a little bit of background if we need to go further into it, because he was here back then as well.
And then the other question I had was, has CFAC reviewed the streamlining concept and approved of this approach?
No, they haven't. City council's prerogative. We needed to start with council. Ultimately, the measure just went into effect. That is Measure E in April. So this was the soonest we can get to you all, and plus we have the budget to process to mind. So we want to get to council soon, but we are speaking with CFAC for April 20th meeting of next week to get their input. But Ms. Lichtig has spoken to several members offline from the CFAC just to get general guidance and the historical perspective as well.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you both.
Thank you, Councilmember Heller. Appreciate that. Councilmember Barton, questions?
I'm looking at the list of the main projects that we are proposing, the 1 and 41, the North T Pier, and the Nutmeg Tank replacement. And I'm wondering if, because we are in competition with the other cities around us, if it might be smart to have a few other smaller projects for when there might be some leftover monies here and there that to be able to propose. I just trying to think about what happens sometimes as you're parceling out money. Sometimes there are smaller amounts left over, and that it might be good that we have some smaller projects to propose as well.
Any specific questions for staff on the report? Councilmember Barton?
No, actually, the report is great. I really appreciated it.
Great. Thank you for that. I very much appreciate it. And let's move to Councilmember Davis. Sir, any questions from you?
Yes, thank you. Do we have a plan to replenish the money that we drew down from the general fund emergency reserve to carry us through the pandemic?
We actually, when we present the budget, the plan is to look at that holistically with the American Recovery Plan dollars. And our current thinking is that we would propose a replenishment from the American Rescue Plan dollars, which is in part precisely what it was intended for.
Okay, so I guess I get the part that confuses me is when you ask if we should apply the same principles to the ARP funds as we're applying to measures E and Q.
Yes, and item number 1D in the principles is to ensure financial health of the city by maintaining appropriate reserves to protect against economic downturn, natural health emergencies, and other unforeseen challenges and opportunities. And so that's why we think that it's appropriate to use those principles. And they wouldn't apply in the same way to the different funding sources. So one might focus on the first three and the other one might do the fourth one and the second one. So if you get my point, is that it'll be appropriate based in the whole to do accomplish something related to all of those things from those two funding sources.
Okay. Another way of saying that is, the rescue plan really kind of stepped in where Measure E was going to have to carry full freight on replenishing the reserves, and there may be a need to use some of Measure E, whereas now the Rescue Act really kind of stands in. And again, that was, by large, was the main rationale for that inclusion for state and local funding in that act. So I think we have an ability to do a little bit of both. And I guess, again, what we're looking for is that flexibility to move from within those funding sources, but ultimately governed by those main philosophies of supporting core services and maintaining a healthy reserve, because there will be emergencies in the future, and we're not completely out of the pandemic just yet.
Yes, our GFER served us well during this extraordinary time, and I have a high desire to replenish it so that it is available for the next emergency. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Davis. Appreciate that. I had a couple of questions, Katie and Scott. First question, is the recommended, I'll call it guidelines that you've laid out in the staff report on page 85 for the utilization of Measure Q and E revenues consistent with the language that was provided to voters that voted on the initiative? And perhaps I'll include Chris if you have any comments on that.
I will speak on our behalf and let the other two chime in. I believe that we think that it absolutely is consistent with the language taken together.
Okay, so that's a yes.
Yes.
Okay, not to mince words, but you believe, or you absolutely are stating that they are aligned, because to me it's very important that what we've presented and represented to the voters is how we are using the funds. And so just generally wanting to make sure that it's consistent with the language.
And Mr. Mayor, just to be clear, that's why I included the language in the staff report.
Right.
So that there was a frame of reference, so that you didn't just have to rely, or the reader didn't have to rely just on my interpretation or Scott or Chris's interpretation. You could see it for yourself. But I believe, yes, it is consistent with that language of both measures.
Yes, and thanks, Katie. I saw that, and sometimes we ask questions just to make sure that it's clear to the public that who may not have read the staff report, that the proposed utilization of funds is consistent with what was represented to the voters that approved the funds. And so that's very important to me. And you're nodding and saying yes. So,
Mr. Mayor, also, I could weigh in. I absolutely concur with Director Leichtig's representation of the two ballot measures. Simply put, California law provides for two types of local taxes that can go to the voters, a general tax and a special tax. General taxes are money that are put into the general fund and can be used for any lawful purpose by the city council. Special taxes require a 2/3 vote, and those are specifically earmarked for specific projects. Both Measure Q and Measure E under California law were special taxes, and they also both, they both were general taxes, and they both were approved by a majority of the voters. And if you look at the literature, both the ballot labels and the impartial analysis, they all state clearly that the money can be used for any general city purpose. Notwithstanding, there is intentions by the council, and there have been, aspirations to use the money for certain purposes, but lawfully, both of these tax measures were passed as general taxes and can be used for any lawful purpose city council deems fit to spend the money on.
Good.
Mayor, I just wanted to add one last thing of the question that was asked earlier about the potential prohibition about using the Measure Q for personnel purposes. The measure says to preserve Morro Bay's safety and character by funding essential services, including upgrading fire and paramedic equipment, fire stations, police, street and pothole repairs, improving storm drains to protect the bay from pollution, and other general city services. Shall an ordinance be adopted increasing the sales tax by half cent, subject to an annual financial audit and establishing an independent advisory committee to review the expenditures. And I just wanted to highlight and emphasize that we provide service through people. So this particular act, at least the way I interpreted it, and I get that it may have been interpreted differently historically, is that it's intended to provide services, essential services, and we provide those services typically through people and personnel.
Great. And that, what you've outlined is language for Measure Q.
That's correct.
And my question would be, is that same statement hold for the language that was included in Measure E?
Measure E was actually slightly more general than Measure Q, and I'm looking for the language in Measure Q.
You mean
specifically?
E. Q is
sorry, yes, I keep getting. I'm looking for E.
That's
I'm
okay.
just glad I didn't call it by another name. I'm used to that. It's maintain 24/7 911 public safety emergency response, 24/7 public services, 24/7 paramedic services, health emergency and disaster preparedness, keep beaches, public areas and restrooms clean and safe, invest in infrastructure, and protect Morro Bay's financial sustainability. Now, that's not an exact quote from the measure. So as you are continuing the conversation, I will go to the clerk recorder's website and pull that up just so that I can make sure that I read it exactly the way it is in the measure.
Yeah, and I guess I just want to make sure your statement regarding personnel is consistent across the board for both Q and E measures.
It is. She can check it, but it is. And Fire Chief Knuckles reminded me that pretty much since the inception of Measure Q, firefighter personnel were funded through Measure Q.
And we actually had the school resource officer when we did half of that was also funded through Measure Q.
Mayor, perhaps to effect some closure on what the money can and can't be used upon, both the ballot labels that were used in 2006 and then the most recent Measure E ballot label, they both say that the money may be used for general city services. That phrase is in both of them. I just pulled up the ballot label for the most recent measure. And again, it's crystal clear in terms of how California law works for local tax measures that go to the voters. It's either a general tax or it's a special tax. If it's a general tax, the city council lawfully can use it for any purpose that a city council can vote to use the revenue for. If it's a special tax, then it's earmarked for specific items. It's either one or the other under California law. Both of these measures were passed as general taxes, and that's how it's codified in the Morro Bay local code, and that's how these operate under state law. So there is no legal issue here in regards to what the money can or can't be used for.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. That's what I'm looking for, just to have clarity and not to be pejorative, but just for consistency. Perhaps next time when we refer to the premises of Q and E, we do have the language for Q in the staff report, but we have a paraphrase for measure E, and it would just be good to have the exact language. So that's just.
I pulled it up. If you'd like me to put it in the record, sir.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I appreciate that.
No problem, and it's a really fair observation. To protect City of Morro Bay's financial stability, local property values, and city services, such as maintaining Morro Bay's local fire/police departments, 24/7 paramedics, 911 emergency response, health emergency/disaster preparedness, keeping beaches, public areas safe and clean, retaining/attracting businesses, and other general city services, shall the measure establishing 1 cent sales tax providing approximately $2 million annually until ended by the voters be adopted, requiring independent audit, public oversight, all funds used locally.
Great. Thank you, Katie. I appreciate that for the record.
Yep.
My next question has to do with, just again, clarity on a number of community members that asked questions, similar to what Councilmember Davis asked with regard to, and Chris, you're certainly welcome to respond. With regard to both Measure Q and Measure E, are there any prohibitions for utilizing some of those funds for replenishment of the general fund emergency reserve? No. That's easy. Thank you. Appreciate that. Succinct answer. Next question I had was, we have completed a rather extensive capital improvement project plan for the water and sewer fund that we're all, I think, familiar with and has been utilized to develop planning over the next 20, 30 years for water and sewer projects. Will we, or when will we, adopt some kind of prioritization methodology to do the same for other capital spending, specifically with regard to the Harbor Enterprise Fund and the general fund? What's the plan for that?
Well, first plan is to onboard our new public works director, who I mentioned at the outset of this meeting. That's going to be one of their primary duties, in addition to getting to know our staff, our council, and our community members. So I'm going to put it on Greg's shoulders to help us with that. Important to note that the One Water plan, which provides really good clarity on overall needs for water, sewer, and stormwater, and creating kind of a prioritization list, if you will, was a major endeavor. It was about a 2-year process to do that. And our general fund and harbor capital is probably in a similar vein in terms of its comprehensiveness, because it includes city facilities, parks, restrooms, docks, piers, street sidewalks, lights, benches, trash cans. It's pretty much everything else that stands on the ground. So I don't necessarily want to put a timeline on it. We may have to phase it in over time, because they do take quite a bit of time and money, of course, to do assessments. But it's absolutely necessary to do that, to do it well, because I think the One Water plan is really a keystone to doing water and sewer projects, and it doesn't provide funding for stormwater, but it does tell us what our stormwater needs are, which is very helpful.
Agreed.
I would say it's probably a 2-year process to get to where we need to be, but as we're going, we certainly can begin investing in those needs as well.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. My last question is, the key questions that you're asking us to respond to as council involve really whether we support the premises that you have put forward that will guide and inform your actual capital and operational budgets. And I assume those budgets obviously will be coming to council for approval, including those under the auspices of Measure E and Measure Q. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Good. Just want the public to be aware that these are just kind of guidelines for staff, at least the way I understand it, for you to move forward with your planning on what you will bring with regard to a capital and operational budget back to us, specifically with regard to not only Measure Q and E, but I got to get the acronym right, to the Rescue Act funds, and then also the earmark potential funding. So good. That's my last question. Thanks so much again. Appreciate that. I'll go ahead and open up public comment. This is public comment for item C-1 on the agenda. Any member of the public wishing to speak on this item, please go ahead and raise your hand now. And Anthony, go ahead and take our first public comment.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I see Betty Winholtz with her hand raised. Let me go ahead and unmute Betty.
Welcome, Betty.
Okay, Betty, I've unmuted you.
Is that better?
Welcome, Betty. We can hear you now.
Thank you. This is Betty. I'm not presenting an argument that either of these measures, Q or E, are general funds and that you can spend them on anything that you want. But as someone who was on the council in 2006 when this was passed, one of the reasons the measure even passed was because there was the guarantee that a citizens committee would be the oversight to say whether or not what staff proposed to spend the money on was aligned with what the citizens were told would be the priorities, and that if there were other items that were in the general fund or within legality that they could be spent on, that they would point that out, but that's not how the citizens interpreted how the money would be spent. So I just want to point out, probably to you as well as to CFAC, and they recognize this, that you're asking them to step away from one of the original mandates they had, was to judge whether projects fit into what the public was told and not told under Measure Q. And so I just want to bring that to your attention.
Thank you, Betty. Next public comment, Anthony.
Yes, Mayor, thank you. I see Erica Crawford with her hand raised. Erica, I've went ahead and unmuted you.
Welcome, Erica.
Hi there. Good evening, Honorable Mayor and City Council. It's Erica from the Chamber. This has been great discussion. Thank you so much for all the council questions and the staff report and the back and forth. Very illuminating. The Chamber is generally supportive of Principles 1 and 2 in your staff report. We draw our support from the policy work in our legislative platform. One element of the platform encourages the city to build on a culture of yes in order to execute projects and plans in a fair, fast, and excellent manner. We support the compensation of city employees at a competitive rate to retain and attract top performers. As the City Council considers these principles of Measure E and Q tonight, we further propose that paying well and getting projects across a finish line does not necessarily mean increasing labor costs on an ongoing basis. The Chamber encourages the Council to consider outsourcing labor and services where capacity is limited or where it is beneficial to do so from the standpoint of expediency and time. In the business world, as you know, time is money. Principle 3 points to investment in infrastructure and equipment that support city services. The Chamber recognizes that our economy was showing signs of strain before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Namely, infrastructure along the commercial corridor of our national estuary was and still is aging without sufficient revenues nor structure and strategy to repair and replace the things like piers and docks. Additionally, services like trash pickup and public restroom maintenance were and still are insufficient to meet the demands on an ongoing basis of a destination that is the third or fifth highest visited in the county, depending on the time of year. We do recognize and applaud the decision last month to step up the staffing level of service related to trash and public restroom maintenance through the 2021 high tourism season. While it's not within necessarily the scope of item C1, we are left wanting a solid understanding as to what the current backlog of unfunded infrastructure projects is. and what reliable and dedicated capital sources are or are to be identified to fund them. Thank you for the discussion there, Mr. Mayor and City Manager Collins. We look forward to getting to know the incoming Public Works Director. Finally, the Chamber did set out to consider what might be the most effective things to do in the areas of business assistance and public works stimulus, city financial sustainability, and support for new development post-pandemic. We did this work in April of 2020. Among our recommendations for strategy to ensure a solid recovery were accelerating the WRF, adding funding for the WRF, and implementing Tideland's lease management policy working group recommendations. We have also, as you know, been proponents for the wayfinding signage installation for many years. Thus, we offer support for earmarks in the realm of WRF and water sustainability, waterfront issues, and wayfinding for either of the Surface Reauthorization Act or the Community Projects funding, which is a separate thing. Our Governmental Affairs Committee had a presentation from Caitlin Cox with Carvajal's office where she told us a bit about the Community Projects funding. This is a program for projects that are smaller, more unique, already anticipated by and beneficial to the community. So I wanted to offer wayfinding and get that into the conversation. That's it. Thank you so much. Sorry for being long-winded.
Thank you, Erica. Anthony, next public comment, please.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I do not see any raised hands left in the queue.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And with that, I'll go ahead and close public comment on item C-1. Bring it back to council. We're looking for basically one direction for the city manager to implement the streamlined process that was outlined by Ms. Lichtig. And please note the changes on page 85 under item 1A, striking the language may include but are limited to. And then on item 1B, striking in the third sentence the but not limited to language. And then on item 2 of that same page, second sentence, consistent with the revised measures Q&E principles. And I think I hopefully captured that, Ms. Lichtig, correctly. Is that correct?
Yes, Mayor.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And then also, question, do we support using the same principles to guide the use of the rescue plan funds totaling approximately $1.98 million? And then lastly, the earmark projects as presented by Mr. Collins, is there support for that? And with that, I'll go ahead and open it up to council members for summary comments and or recommendation, starting with Council Member Barton. Any summary comments or recommendations?
No, I am very pleased with what has been recommended. And so I'd like to proceed.
Okay, great. So you basically are supporting the key questions that I outlined and the staff recommendation.
Yes.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. Council Member Addis, please. Summary comments or your thoughts?
Yep, I am all for streamlining, and I think I'm probably one of the CFAC members who questions if the level of detail was necessary. And so I'm very glad to support the principles and using those same principles for the ARP funds and also the 3 projects mentioned by the city manager.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that very much. Councilmember Heller.
Yeah, I generally support the principles. I do want to comment, though. I agree with council members' concern about the ARP funds, and the way the staff report is written, it basically implies that the same principles that are applied to Q&E can also be applied to the ARP funds. I look at the ARP funds primarily as a source of replenishing our general fund emergency reserve account, which has been so depleted by the pandemic. as the primary purpose of those funds. So I'm not completely comfortable with the language that would apply the same principles to the ARP funds as the Q&E funds. But I think it will all come out in the wash during the budgeting process, I assume. But I just want to go on record as saying the primary purpose of the ARP funds, in my opinion, is to replenish our general fund emergency reserve account. Thank you.
Good. Thanks for that comment. I appreciate that. Councilmember Davis.
Yes, I too support the principles as amended by Katie tonight. And I support the earmark projects with a caution. And I know that Scott is already doing this, but be sure to coordinate your earmark project closely with Carvajal's office, because he is getting input, as Scott said earlier, from every city in his district. And if we have to sacrifice one of these projects to support another, we need to be ready to do that. So that's my input.
Thank you, Councilmember Davis. And I'll echo concurrence with all of the comments that were made, including Councilmember Heller's comment. I too really feel the need to replace the General Emergency Reserve Fund as quickly as possible. So I think what you're hearing is, I've heard others comment, hopefully when we do receive the budget, there'll be an emphasis on that. But I support the concepts proposed for Measure E and Q principles as presented and revised tonight with the revised language that Ms. Lichtig outlined. And I also support the same principles to guide the usage of the ARP funds, and also the earmark projects as presented by staff. I have support for that as well. My conversation with Congressman Carvajal about 2 weeks ago and his office with regard to the earmarks, most likely each congressional member will have the opportunity to really nail it down to about 10 projects throughout their district. And most likely, according to staff, each member will probably get anywhere from 2 to 3 total projects that will be allowed to be approved across the district. So not for each city, but that's across their whole district. So it will be highly competitive, and I think we've got a good handle on some very important projects that certainly are appropriate for those funds. So with that, I think Mr. Collins and Ms. Lichtig, do you need any further guidance? And I don't think we need a formal motion, from what I can tell. Scott?
I was under the impression that you did need a vote because we didn't present a resolution. So in order to have a minute order, so well,
I'm looking here, maybe Chris could help. The recommendation is direct the city manager to implement a streamlined process. And so I think you've heard that general direction from the council, and then authorize the presentation of the proposed uses, and then provide city staff with input regarding federal earmarks, which we've done. But Chris, would you like me to frame that in a motion?
No, that would be something at the city manager's discretion. Lawfully, it doesn't have to be done, but it might provide crystal clear direction to staff on a mandate to move forward with these 3 questions that were presented, rather than relying upon, we all were at the meeting and we are pretty sure everyone agreed with it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'd be important to have a motion on Measure QE. I think there's The other two are more one-time in nature. So if we can get a motion on Measure QE, the philosophy there, then that would be helpful for legislative record.
Sure, be happy to. I'll go ahead and make a motion that we direct the city manager to implement a streamlined process for allocating local voter-approved transaction and use taxes, commonly referred to as Measure Q and E, in accordance with Ordinance Number 635, and propose allocations of Measure Q and E revenue consistent with the revised principles A through D that were outlined by Ms. Lichtig. Number two, that we authorize the city manager to present proposed uses of the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 consistent with the revised Measure Q and E principles and guidance issued from the U.S. Department of Treasury. And third, to receive the input regarding federal earmarks and agreement with the concepts that are presented by staff.
Second.
Okay, motion by Mayor Heading for the staff recommendation as amended with language presented by Ms. Lichtig, second by Councilmember Addis. And any further discussion? Okay, roll call vote, please.
Councilmember Addis?
Yes.
Councilmember Barton?
Yes.
Councilmember Davis?
Yes.
Councilmember Heller?
Yes.
And Mayor Heading?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
And again, thank you, staff, for the comprehensive look at this. We really appreciate it. Very clear. Thanks for putting it all together in 3 different buckets that allowed us to really concentrate on each of those. And we'll look forward to actually reviewing for approval after CFAC review the items that may come for both the capital and operational budget. So again, thanks for all your work. We appreciate that. That brings us to item C-2. This is a discussion of the local firearm safety and regulation with the request to provide direction to staff. This is an item that was agendized by majority agreement over a year ago, and because of a number of things, including COVID-19, got placed on the back burner, but happy that it's coming forward now, and I'll turn it over to our city attorney, I believe, for a presentation. Thank you, Chris.
Good evening, Honorable Mayor and City Council members. I will be presenting tonight a staff report on local firearm safety and regulation. And I'd like to say thank you to Chief Cox and Morro Bay Police Department Officer Aaron Miller for their assistance with some of the ideas and for providing some of the research for this. Both the Chief and I are here tonight, and Officer Miller, to answer questions, and I'll be presenting the report. This report, I have a PowerPoint that I will share my screen with to provide both the background on why we're having this discussion tonight, and then present a number of options. And I want to say at the outset that my task was to provide options for the council. I don't believe it's the city attorney's role to give an opinion on whether these policies are good, bad, or should be pursued further. I'm simply providing options to the council, and I leave the policy decisions, of course, to the elected leaders of the city. With that, I will put on my PowerPoint and proceed. So as Mayor Heading summarized at the beginning, this staff report was originally prepared and was in a council agenda report back in, I believe it was March of 2020. And because of COVID and a number of other priorities that shifted for the city, this staff report was tabled, and it has now been brought back at council request in some part due to the recent uptick in mass shootings. Now that, unfortunately, the COVID pandemic seems to be lessening, we seem to now see an increase in mass shootings across the nation. What I have here at the beginning of the staff report is I wanted to itemize a clear list of different possible policy ideas for the council to consider. And if council likes any of these, then council could direct staff to come back with a more robust articulation of how these could be implemented in the city. The first group of policy recommendations or policy ideas to consider are safety regulations and programs, and I'll be going through those in the staff report. And then there's three other ideas: advocacy at federal and state levels, gun violence restraining orders, education on that, and then market leveraging of city firearm purchases. So as mentioned before, council had requested this report back in over a year ago in the wake of continuing mass shootings throughout the nation. At the time, the community and the region and the nation was reeling from the Gilroy mass shooting. Most recently, we've had a number of mass shootings just in March in Orange, California, Boulder, Colorado, and Atlanta, Georgia. Putting this into context, annually there are about 40,000 firearm-related deaths nationally, and suicides account for almost 60% of deaths related to firearms. In regards to mass shootings, I do have in the staff report a list of just some of them. As I articulated, there was a few of them that I already mentioned, but in the staff report, I mentioned how in 2014, there were 6 people killed and 14 injured by gunmen in Santa Barbara. I personally remember that, and I'm sure a lot of us do too. 2017, 59 people were massacred out in Las Vegas, Nevada, the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival. I again remember that in the news, and I'm sure most of us do. The list goes on. October 2018, a gunman killed 11 people at a synagogue in Pittsburgh. Thousand Oaks, 2018, there was a shooting. 13 people died. Of course, regionally, July 28, 2019, 16 people were shot and 3 were killed by a gunman at the Gilroy Garlic Festival in Gilroy, California. And most recently, not to diminish any of these that I've listed or any of the other ones that have occurred, in March 16th, a gunman killed 8 people at 3 spas in Atlanta, Georgia. March 22nd, a gunman opened fire at a Boulder, Colorado supermarket, killing 10 people, including a police officer. And on March 31st, 2021, a gunman killed 4 people, including a 9-year-old boy at an office park in Orange, California. Now, I also want to mention that along with these facts on shootings that have occurred, it's important to understand that defenders of firearm ownership also argue that there's facts that support their position for firearm possession. Even though the statistics are disputed, there are statistics that show that there certainly is some crime that is stopped by firearm possession. I have a quote here in the staff report from the Institute of Medicine and National Research Council, which says that defensive use of guns by crime victims is a common occurrence, although the exact number remains disputed. Almost all national surveys estimate that there's defensive gun use by victims are at least as common as offensive use by criminals, with estimates of annual uses ranging from about 500,000 to more than 3 million. In the context of about 300,000 violent crimes involving firearms back in 2008. The study also says that some scholars say that there's a much lower estimate, maybe only about 100,000 annual defensive uses. Variations in these numbers remain a controversy in the field. I wish that I could have solid statistics, but I do want to say that it remains disputed on how often firearms are used for defense against crime. So before we get into talking about local regulation or policy ideas for firearm safety, it's important to understand the national context of Second Amendment rights. The Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." That is in the Bill of Rights. It's one of the original 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The meaning of this Second Amendment has been vigorously debated by legal scholars. There was some clarity on that in 2008 when, in a disputed 5-4 decision, the United States Supreme Court confirmed that the Second Amendment protects the right of an individual to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia and to use that firearm for traditional lawful purposes such as self-defense. The decision came out of Washington, D.C. The case is known as the D.C. Heller case. Obviously, it's not Councilmember Heller. It was a security guard in Washington, D.C. who challenged a D.C. law that, among other things, said that you have to register any handguns you have, but they wouldn't provide registration for handguns. So effectively, it was a ban, and the court said that violates the Second Amendment. However, as further explained by this seminal Supreme Court decision, in the Heller decision, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. Nothing in our opinion should be taken to cast doubt on long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places, such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. So the Second Amendment and how it applies continues to swirl about in the courts. Interesting to note is, of course, this issue was not resolved by that Supreme Court decision. Just in 2017, a California law was taken to federal court. This California law prohibited the sale of firearm magazines holding more than 10 rounds of ammunition. A federal court said that violates the Second Amendment. That went on appeal. The appellate court said it does violate the Second Amendment, and now it's on another appeal to a full Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal review, which could have up to 25 federal judges reviewing this. And so that decision is pending. That second appeal was just confirmed on February 25th, 2021. So that is federal law. What about California law? The California Constitution does not have a section equivalent to the federal Second Amendment. In fact, the California Supreme Court has expressly said there is no right to bear arms in our state constitution. As for California law itself, arguably California, the state, has one of the most robust firearm regulations regimes in the United States. This already includes statewide universal background checks, gun dealer licensing, assault weapon prohibition, safety training for firearm purchasers, gun show regulations, waiting periods, etc. It's important to note, of course, that there are 50 sets of state laws all across the country. Federal law remains sparse. So, what California has on the books obviously is not what Nevada, Arizona, Texas, Massachusetts, New York necessarily have. So we have the Second Amendment, which definitely protects the right to bear arms, to have firearms. And the U.S. Supreme Court confirmed in 2010 that absolutely that Second Amendment applies to state and local governments. This is important because it clarified for sure that the Second Amendment does apply to Morro Bay, San Luis Obispo County, state of California. As for California restrictions, California state law preempts a lot of local firearm laws, but it doesn't prohibit all of them. A good example is that California law prohibits registering or licensing firearms in the local level. That simply is prohibited. On the flip side, California law allows local governments, counties, to prohibit firearms on public property. So there is room for local regulation within the California legal structure, but it's not across the board. And needless to say, this is all overshadowed by the Second Amendment, also provides restrictions nationwide. So what laws do we have on the books in Morro Bay right now? What policies? Chapter 9.16 in Morro Bay's local code basically prohibits the discharge of a firearm within city limits. There are some exceptions, self-defense, obviously police officer use, and a few other limited circumstances. But in general, you can't fire a gun in city limits subject to the exceptions. As for the police department, Morro Bay Police Department actually has a robust set of policies. Policy 4112 is the rapid response and deployment policy, which involves responding to active shooter, mass shooter events. Morro Bay Police Department Policy 342 provides for seeking gun violence restraining orders by law enforcement if they see the need. And policy 207 involves a license to carry a firearm, basically a carry concealed weapon permit. So with that background in mind, now I have a number of different policy ideas for the council to consider. First one, safety regulations. So Morro Bay right now has a number of local regulations it could pass. One of the biggest ones is safe storage laws. California law already requires, the penal code does, that if there's a firearm in the house and there's someone that lives there or someone that could have access to it who can't legally possess a firearm, then that firearm must be safely stored. And what that means basically is that if there is a child that is unauthorized to have access to the firearm, maybe someone visiting, then it needs to be stored. And also if someone's prohibited by federal or state law from possessing a firearm. But if those conditions are not present, then you do not have to, under California law, have safe storage of the firearm in the house. And the courts have ruled that it is permissible to pass local safe storage laws. Most famously, San Francisco had one that was challenged a number of years ago, and the federal courts in 2014 upheld their safe storage law. So that's one option for council if it would like to pursue that. And again, this is a list of policy ideas. If council is interested in any of these, then staff could come back with a more detailed and robust, draft ordinance or, further details on these policy proposals. Another policy idea, which is, if you will, on the cutting edge, is requiring firearm owners to carry liability insurance. Now, I want to stress that it is unclear if such a requirement would conflict with either the Second Amendment or even state law. This issue came to a head in the city of San Jose in 2019, largely a reaction to the Gilroy mass shooting, where that city has begun to explore the idea of requiring insurance if you have a firearm, equivalent to if you have an automobile, you need insurance. Now, to be clear, this insurance wouldn't cover intentional acts, but it would cover accidental injuries, and it would be a policy that you would need to purchase, otherwise you wouldn't be able to lawfully possess that firearm. San Jose also had this idea that if you couldn't secure the insurance, then you would pay a fee to the city, and that money could be used for presumably some sort of firearm safety program. And that raises some preemption issues because, as I'd mentioned before, state law prohibits registry of firearms. So if that were to be used, the city would need to be careful that it doesn't create a de facto gun registry requirement. This proposal came out from San Jose back in August 2019. As reported in August 2020, similar to the city of Morro Bay tabling this report for over a year, San Jose started to slow down on addressing this idea. Back in August 2020, San Jose mayor said that he's absolutely committed to seeing this through. And likewise, gun rights groups said that they're waiting to take San Jose to court if it follows through with any of these requirements. The most recent research of this indicates that, as reported in March 2021, a mayor spokesperson in San Jose stated, quote, "An independent third party is currently collecting data on the public costs of gun violence in San Jose and Santa Clara County. Conversation with residents and community groups are also ongoing. A report is expected by the end of June." So we need to stay tuned to see if San Jose is going to do this. My research indicates that San Jose would be the first city to impose a requirement like this. The third regulation that the council could consider is firearms in public property. Right now, California law prohibits the carrying of loaded firearms in public places or on public streets. However, the exception is provided in the law that if you have a CCW license, a carry concealed weapon permit, then you can. Now, those CCW licenses are subject to strict issuance, and if council has questions on that, then the police chief can respond to that. But the basic point here is that the city can ban even CCW holders from carrying firearms onto city property. The city of Fresno did this in February 2020 on the basis of just less guns saved lives. As I mentioned in the staff report, Fresno police chief at the time basically said he's happy to see the city of Fresno taking this proactive stance rather than waiting to react to violence. That police chief said while saying CCW holders are good citizens. He also said it can be a complication for officers responding to an active scene. That new ordinance also requires police officers be stationed at City Hall. Now, again, in the context of considering whether or not CCW holders should not be allowed to bring firearms in public property, which could include, City Hall, public parks, etc., I did also put in the staff report that there are a number of examples of, if you want to call them Good Samaritan CCW holders, actually preventing crime. January 13th, 2020, in Arizona, a CCW holder legally carrying a gun shot a man attacking an Arizona state trooper who was ambushed next to a freeway. December 30th, 2019, in Texas, a firearms instructor who trained others in his Texas church to use guns to protect the congregation fatally shot a gunman seconds after he opened fire during a service. Another example, in 2018 in Alabama, a father armed with a pistol stopped what could have been a mass shooting inside an Alabama McDonald's when he took down a masked gunman who stormed in and opened fire. There are many other examples, and again, I wanted to make sure that these examples are present as we're discussing, these possible policy ideas within the context of course, we've had 3 recent mass shootings in the nation where innocent lives were taken. So can Morro Bay do this? Yes. Morro Bay, the California Supreme Court affirmed in 2002, local governments can ban possession of guns on city property. And if the city were to do this, it could follow some other cities' examples. Cupertino and Campbell prohibit the possession of firearms in city parks. City of Mountain View prohibits firearms in city parks and city recreational facilities. Another approach of City of Palo Alto has basically prohibited all firearms, and then it gives exceptions. I would recommend the first approach. That's more legally defensible. And definitely, this is something that would be, it seems, new for the region. The Morro Bay Police Department reached out previously when this report was originally published to neighboring communities and concluded that the cities of Paso, Grover Beach, Arroyo Grande, Atascadero, and San Luis Obispo reported they have no current policies restricting a private citizen from lawfully carrying a firearm with a valid CCW. If council would like to pursue this type of local regulation, then again, with direction, staff could bring back an ordinance to consider. And another safety regulation is to regulate local firearms businesses. Again, this is something the city can do. Cities can regulate local firearm businesses within limits. It actually is a common local regulation to require a local permit or license in addition to a business license to operate a firearms business. Not only would this be something where the city can keep tabs on local firearm businesses, but pursuant to that permit or license, it could require certain extras for the business, such as having the city monitor local firearms sales by videotaping it to perhaps prevent, to perhaps help law enforcement for future crime detection or to see maybe who was involved in some crime down the road with firearms. It could require regular inventory reports. It also could be something used to prohibit no residential sales, to not allow home businesses for firearms. Again, this is something that Morro Bay Police Department Chief Cox can speak more to if council is interested. It appears that in the city right now, there is one storefront firearms business, and it is largely limited to antique firearms, and there are 2 home businesses. And when we get to questions, if council has more questions about this aspect, then again, Chief Cox has actually reviewed this issue to see what the impact would be. And then 3 more ideas, firearm safety programs. The city could actually sponsor in-person training on various aspects of firearm safety, including storage, the laws, etc., through the Morro Bay Police Department. This could be something where officers, for example, on the Morro Bay PD range team could potentially lead courses, maybe use the community center for public firearm safety and awareness classes. Although the city could fund this, it's possible that money could be raised from private sources through donations to support a program like this. Another aspect of this was potentially firearm safety training could be offered for parents and students at Morro Bay High School. And when speaking with the police department, it's recommended that if council does want to do this, then we need to make sure that overtime is provided for officers leading the courses, and we secure funding sources for this. Another option is annual gun buyback program. This is a very popular one that communities all across the nation use. It's basically to get old and potentially dangerous firearms out of the community, out of homes. What would happen is basically the PD would offer to buy back guns, essentially no questions asked. And then if they are dangerous, they would be destroyed. Otherwise, they perhaps could be refurbished for department use, or if they have some historical or antique value, potentially provided to a local gun dealer. And the third idea would be to have supplemental Morro Bay Police Department officer mass active shooter training. There are extra courses that could be taken through post to get certified mass active shooter training. This would allow our officers to be as trained as much as possible to respond to a mass or active shooter event in the city. Also, another idea is to authorize overtime for off-duty firearms training, and perhaps to include increased ammunition for training purposes, for mass active shooter training purposes. If the council is interested in this option, again, the Police Chief Cox is able to speak in more detail to how that would work. So I've gone over safety regulations, and I've gone over different policies and regulations the city could consider adopting. And now we have three other broad areas that the city could pursue in regards to gun regulation, firearm safety and regulation. The second broad area is advocacy at the federal and state levels. As I've detailed above, local firearm regulation is restricted significantly by, of course, federal law and constitutional rights and state law. But there is still room on the federal level for more regulation of firearms. And if council desired a broad change in firearm regulation, the greatest change would need to come from the federal level, and the state could also do some more. A good example of this is that the Gilroy mass shooter, notwithstanding assault rifles are essentially banned in California, was able to lawfully purchase the one used at the mass shooting in Nevada and then bring it back into California. So obviously there are some issues that would be more properly addressed at the federal level. Council could write advocacy letters on that. On that note, things have changed a bit since this report was prepared a year ago. The new presidential administration has actually begun to advocate for a new nationwide assault ban. There was one back in 1994. It lapsed in 2004. President Biden is asking Congress to consider that again. President Biden's also asking for greater regulation of gun shows, expansion of federal background checks, etc. There isn't as much room on the state level, but advocates have proposed that there could be more community violence prevention programs, could be some tighter regulations consistent with the Second Amendment. And interestingly, just recently, this month, state lawmakers have advanced a proposal for a new tax on the sale of guns and ammunition in California to boost funding for violence prevention programs. So I mentioned some of these examples of what state and federal laws could look like. If council wants to take an advocacy position, then certainly advocacy letters could be authorized to be sent on behalf of the city council. The third area, we've gone over safety and safety policies and local firearm regulation. We've talked about advocacy letters. The third area is gun violence restraining orders. Now, this is something where it's not a local law that Morro Bay potentially would pass. It's simply educating residents on these laws are already available under state law. Basically, these are red flag laws where a court order, if a judge determines that it is unsafe for an individual to have either temporary or long-term access to a firearm, will prohibit that individual from having access and will take away any firearms they have at the moment. California law provides, it has provided for this since 2016, for family and household members, as well as law enforcement officers, to seek these gun violence restraining orders, the GVROs. And whether or not individuals in the community are aware of this law could make a difference into whether or not it's used and potentially prevents a suicide or a shooting. I will point out that, again, there are debates on whether or not these are effective laws or whether or not, they're ones that should be promoted. A study in 2018 by a team of psychiatrists from Duke University, they examined Connecticut's red flag laws, and they concluded that for every 10 to 20 uses of these types of laws, one suicide was prevented. Another study concluded that basically there were absolute drops in suicide that they felt were connected to uses of red flag laws. Of course, critics question the effectiveness of these red flag laws in the first place, and on a fundamental level, they argue that these laws infringe on Second Amendment rights. That stems largely from the burden of proof for getting one of these orders is less than the burden of proof you need generally in a criminal conviction. So critics argue that, basically firearms can be taken away and you don't have to have the same standard of proof as you would in a criminal case. Nevertheless, these have become very popular, and it is the law in California, and this would be one way for the city council to if the council wants to address gun violence by just simply educating the populace and educating the community on this current state law. And the final option is market leveraging. This, again, is just one of multiple options for council to consider. It's an interesting idea. It doesn't seem to have gotten much traction throughout the country, but the basic idea is to use market leverage to change the conduct of firearms manufacturers. Perhaps most famously, Jersey City, New Jersey, in 2014, they added a bidding requirement for law enforcement firearms contracts to give explanations on how they're combating illegal or straw firearm purchases. I don't think that Morro Bay has enough leverage, given its size and the size of its law enforcement, to actually have much market leverage on its own. But if the city wanted to pursue this, then staff could reach out to see if maybe a regional or even statewide coalition could be created to combine the market power of different law enforcement agencies and see if this could make a difference as well. There is a private group that has organized efforts along these lines. It's an organization called Do Not Stand Idly By. As of the end of 2018, they have enlisted 132 jurisdictions, ranging from Los Angeles to San Francisco to Stockton, to make at least requests for information from gun manufacturers on what they're doing to basically try to bring about a decline in gun violence. So what I would ask council to do, if council would be so inclined, is that if council is interested in any of these policy ideas, then to go through the list here of the various safety regulations and programs, and then the second, third, and fourth ideas I have, and provide direction to staff on bringing back further details. Or at council's pleasure, council can simply receive and file this report. And I am available for any questions, as is Morro Bay Police Department Chief Jody Cox and Morro Bay Police Department Officer Aaron Miller.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate your comprehensive presentation. And the updates that you made were very helpful compared to the last report that was done almost a year ago. So thank you for that. With that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up. This will be council questions first. Again, the staff is looking for direction this evening on some of these areas, as Chris has talked about, with regard to further potential for either looking at policy changes that might impact the issue at hand. And so I'm going to go ahead and open up for questions. Start with Councilmember Heller. Do you have any questions?
I do, and I'll start with Chief Cox. So, Chief, how effective do you think buyback programs are?
Good question, Councilmember Heller, and I believe they can be effective in some jurisdictions.
Locally here in Morro Bay, we don't actually see a lot of gun issues. And having never done one in this region, it would be difficult to tell, but we have experienced here at Morro Bay PD where several people have brought firearms. Either a relative has passed away or a spouse has passed away, or they've come across, they found one in their home that they didn't want, where they have brought those to us and turned them in to the police department, both firearms and ammunition, and asked that they be destroyed, which we're happy to collect and do that. But I think anytime you have a buyback program, you can be successful with it, because those people that may have one in the home that typically don't use it or are not real comfortable with having it in their possession might be willing to turn it in to receive some kind of a small benefit. And that some of those have been through cash payment, some of those have been through some type of a gift card or something of that nature. And it varies in price on the type of firearm. And I think an example is some of them may pay $100 for a handgun or a rifle, and up to $200 for, say, some type of an assault weapon. So people that have those that aren't necessarily comfortable with them would respond to that kind of a program.
Okay. Another question for you, Chief, is if you find someone who's in possession of an assault weapon that's not legal, what is the fine or penalty for possessing that?
Well, it's a felony to possess an illegal assault weapon.
Okay.
So anytime we come across anybody in possession of an illegal weapon, that's an arrestable offense.
And is this I know we've talked about this a little bit, is this something the district attorney's office would prosecute and follow through on, or what would be the procedure if you found somebody, the process? Well,
you're referring to an assault weapon, so to speak, but and that's a different penalty as opposed to some of the recent legislation changes where just possession of a weapon or possession of a firearm is a misdemeanor. So with some of the recent changes, that has become a challenge, especially over, as we've seen in the last year, where the jails are not able to hold on to a lot of people due to COVID and those types of things. While we'll take the firearm as evidence, a lot of those people are being cited out. So depending on what the weapon is and depending on that particular charge, would determine whether they're in custody or not. But the district attorney has been good about prosecuting those types of cases, just based on the surge we've seen in gun violence across the country.
Okay. Let's see. So one of the we got some public comments saying that assault weapons are banned throughout the United States for the sale of assault weapons. Is that true? Do you know if that's true?
Well, I can't speak to some of the other state laws. I'm not familiar with all of the laws in other states, but what is classified as an assault weapon is illegal in the state of California. Now, it's my understanding there are some states that you can purchase those types of weapons, but you cannot. And as our attorney Chris Meyer pointed out earlier, California has the strictest laws in the entire nation when it comes to gun purchasing, and that includes background checks, registration checks, record keeping processes, all of those things. So a lot of further regulation, even at a federal level, won't have a lot of impact directly on California because our laws and regulations are currently so strict.
So, Councilmember Heller, if I could, I think it's useful to understand that when folks talk about assault weapons, they're generally referring to semi-automatic rifles. Automatic firearms are just not illegal. But semi-automatic are, and that's the real core of the issue, in that there used to be a federal ban on assault weapons, semi-automatic weapons, and then that expired in 2004. And then there's a patchwork of laws where California prohibits them, or more accurately, prohibits the purchase of new ones. Current ones, there were ones that were grandfathered in, like guns didn't need to be turned in. So assault weapon, what does it mean? It's generally a semi-automatic rifle, but there's a lot of different designs, and whether a particular semi-automatic rifle does or does not fall within California's ban, what the definition is, it proves to be somewhat murky, but generally it's semi-automatic rifles. I know Officer Miller, I believe Officer Miller might have some thoughts on this, if not some of the other issues we'll be talking about.
Okay. So Chris, I have another question for you now that you're looking at a lot of different policies that the city might adapt. How likely is it that if we adapt any or some of these policies, is it that a gun rights group would sue the city or oppose the adoption of one of these policies?
Well, what I can do is provide an overview of which ones of these proposed regulations the courts have said are constitutional, which ones the courts haven't even addressed, and which ones the courts are unclear on. Safe storage laws, the federal courts have said it is lawful to add more requirements than what the penal code has. So that I don't expect there is legal exposure. That is 1A, safe storage laws. Now, of course, it depends on what we mean by safe storage laws. I would probably suggest modeling it on San Francisco's policy that was approved by the federal court in 2014. As for 1B, firearm owners liability insurance, that, to use the legal term, is a hot potato. It is something that I don't really think any jurisdiction has done that. San Jose has been talking a lot about it. I would expect a lawsuit probably sooner rather than later for whoever blazes that trail and passes that kind of a law. Firearms and public property, that is something the courts have said, yes, we absolutely can prohibit them on public property. Firearm businesses, it depends upon the regulations. And then as for firearm safety, buyback program, and supplemental police department mass active shooter training and provisions, those three are all obviously lawful and would be at the discretion of the council.
Okay. And then Chief Cox, going back to you, another question. Which of these policies, if any of them, will help you protect our residents, in your opinion?
Well, I think the last three that Attorney Meyer pointed out, the training, the education, and even the buyback program would be helpful. I think educating our community in regards to what the current laws are, and into proper storage of firearms and those types of things. Some of these other regulations will have very little, if any, impact on the actual purchase of a firearm. And what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example of the videotaping as an issuance. The current laws that are required for them, they're taking copies of the ID. They've got extensive background and records checks that are currently being used, and all of their records are susceptible to inspection at any time. We can walk in and ask to see them. So requiring a business to videotape a sale doesn't necessarily prevent a law-abiding citizen from purchasing a firearm. So therefore, it's not creating a safer avenue for us. The same with requiring another local permit, so to speak. Well, that might generate a small amount of revenue. We have one local storefront here in Morro Bay who does not deal in new firearms. He deals only in older and antique firearms, has very limited business. So something like that is not going to change the purchasing of a firearm. The other two smaller businesses that we have are both internet-based, and both of them deal mostly with law enforcement and CCW people online with very limited sales. So again, it's not going to impact those people that have the lawful ability to purchase or own a firearm. So some of those types of regulations, we would not see a direct impact. I do believe that the education component, the training component, and even doing some community outreach public training would be beneficial to our community, because we don't see a lot of gun-related incidents here in Morro Bay. And as an example, we pulled up some numbers for this meeting, and I think over the last about 8 years, we've only had about 15 gun-related incidents of any kind, and those again have not been high-profile, shootings or those types of things. It's a report of someone who may have had a firearm in their possession. We did have a shooting here a few months ago where a gentleman came in from out of town and shot at a residence where there was a relationship issue. But fortunately, we don't see a lot of gun-related incidents or violence in our community or in our region.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for answering my questions. And Chris, thank you for the report. That's all I have as far as
questions. Thank you, Councilmember Heller. Appreciate that. Councilmember Davis, questions, sir?
No, sir. I have no questions.
Hey, Councilmember Barton, questions?
I don't have any questions.
Okay. Councilmember Addis, questions?
Thank you, Mayor. I just have a couple, and thank you to City Attorney Neumeier for doing this report, and Chief Cox and Officer Miller, and to you, Mayor, for partnering with me on bringing this forward. I am proud of our council for taking up this difficult topic. One of my questions, I think Chief Cox already answered, was on the business question around permitting and sales and reporting and how this would affect local businesses, but it sounds like there's just the one storefront and very limited sales with the internet-based businesses. I think I got that answered. And with the gun buyback, it sounds like, Chief Cox, you think this has potential. I'm wondering if it would be more effective or even feasible to partner with another jurisdiction to do a buyback, and also what kind of costs would be incurred for doing how expensive would it be to try to see if it's worth it?
I had Officer Miller do a little background under the buyback program, so I'm going to defer to him and let him share with you what he found.
Good evening, Council. I did some research into San Jose. Sorry about that. Good evening, Council. I did some research into San Jose PD's gun buyback model. Starting in 2013, San Jose PD began a gun buyback where they were able to retrieve 463 firearms. 7 of them were assault weapons. San Jose PD paid $100 for handguns, rifles, and shotguns, and they paid $200 for all assault weapon firearms. The Santa Clara County DA provided some information from 2013 to 2019. 6,000 firearms were collected at a average rate of 1,000 firearms per year, and they set a cap of $400 provided to each person maximum, because some people would come in with a large amount of firearms to surrender, so they made that cap to be able to spread the buyback money out further. Furthermore, based on population rate and the amount of firearms that were surrendered, the city of Morro Bay could estimate approximately to net approximately 142 firearms. And with that, they would need approximately $15,000 to do that.
Thank you. And then I know we've had some feedback that we don't need to talk about this issue because it doesn't happen here. So if you could talk about why training would be needed if Morro Bay is, I believe Morro Bay is a relatively safe community. I am concerned because mass shootings, I believe, can happen anywhere. But why would Morro Bay PD need active shooter training if it's been so safe all along?
Yeah, I'll take that. And the reason for training, as with anything in law enforcement, is to be prepared for any eventuality that can occur. And although Morro Bay specifically doesn't see a lot of that, we have seen it throughout the county over the last year, where we've had probably 4 active shooter situations in Napomo, in Atascadero, and Paso Robles, to where we've seen that happen. So the training is not only to keep our personnel prepared to respond at any given time that we would have that, because again, there's been several small communities that have experienced that. And I believe one of the callers earlier tonight mentioned, and I don't remember her name, but she herself had some experiences, and she made the comment that a lot of these have occurred in small communities, just like Morro Bay, where it's a perfect, quiet, serene community until it isn't. So training is something that we take very serious here at Morro Bay. We try to stay on top of all of that, because when it happens, if you're not trained, prepared, and ready for it, it's too late. So we need to continue to train to be ready for those things. I've just recently purchased for all of the officers here active shooter equipment that gives them the ability to respond. They have the equipment with them in their vehicles. They carry it at all times, so they can respond directly to that scene with the equipment that is required to keep them and the community safe. But again, as we've seen at least 4 times over the last year, our smaller communities around Morro Bay are also experiencing that type of issues, where we've been required to respond and assist them as well.
Thank you. And maybe you already said this a minute ago, but is there data on use of the red flag or gun violence restraining orders? I guess they're the red flag restraining orders. Is there data on use of those locally and effectiveness of them locally, or we might not even know? I know they're pretty new and it can be hard to tell sometimes.
The gun violence restraining orders have been in effect in California for about 5 years, and they're often referred to and interchanged with the red flag laws. We don't have any data locally about how many times they have been used, but it has recently been expanded. And as our attorney Newmeyer mentioned earlier, previously when this came out, it was that a household member or law enforcement could petition a court or a judge to express concern over an individual for a variety of reasons, expressing dangerous tendencies or mental illness or those types of things, and knowing that subject was in possession of a firearm. There's been some expansion in that to also allow teachers and other people who may have direct knowledge of maybe a juvenile or a student or somebody else. So again, as the attorney mentioned, there has been some pushback in that process for someone to claim that an individual is dangerous, and for law enforcement to go out and subsequently deprive them of their right to possess a firearm based on nothing more than someone's opinion or a claim that is made without any evidentiary information to back that up. We haven't run into that as of yet. And here locally in Morro Bay, we've not run into the issue where we've had to issue a gun violence restraining order as of yet.
If I remember correctly, I'm not sure if this is a question, but I'll see if you remember it this way. The shooting in Santa Barbara, the family had tried numerous times to do something knowing that individual was declining in his mental health. And I believe the red flag laws came about after that shooting, and folks have said they thought that shooting maybe could have been prevented were red flag laws in place at that time.
Santa Barbara shooting was 2014, and these new laws came into effect in 2016.
Was that the Isla Vista incident? Yes, correct. And I believe that there was some indication from family members that that they had reached out to law enforcement who at the time didn't believe that the subject met the criteria based on the information that they had obtained. Again, since that time, and law enforcement now understanding how critical these issues are, when we receive that type of information, you have to dig a little deeper. You have to take the time to really look into what the claims are and look a little deeper into each one of those situations, because again, and that's one of the problems with human behaviors. You really don't know what takes somebody where one day they're a fine person and the next day they're doing something that's unspeakable that nobody ever saw coming.
Well, I appreciate that, and it's super sad and disturbing. And one of the young men that was killed in the Isla Vista shooting was a San Luis High graduate whose father lives in Los Osos and is a local community member. That's it on my questions, Mayor. I have plenty of comments when we get to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Addis. Appreciate that. Thanks, Chief, for your information. Again, thank you, Chris, for your comprehensive report. And Officer Miller, thank you also for your comments tonight. We appreciate that. A couple of additional questions that I have. Given the fact that 60%, as I recall, I don't know if I find my notes here from the report, but I think 60% of suicides occur at the hands or basically occur with the use of a firearm. And specifically looking at safe storage laws, and I'm not sure, Chief, if this is for you or whomever may want to answer this, but looking at safe storage laws, given the current law in California versus the San Francisco policy, do you personally see an advantage in perhaps considering something like that to address this, in my mind, very significant issue?
I believe the safe storage law could have some impact, and that one requires, again, if anybody in the home who is not legally able to possess the firearm, that it would have to be stored. So, an example, in my home, it's me and my wife who are both legally able to possess a firearm, but I also raise my grandson, who is not legally able to possess. So any firearm in my home is always stored. It's always locked and secured. And that's what the requirement would be. So if you had a juvenile or maybe a subject that lived in your home that was on probation or parole who could not legally possess a firearm, it would be required that firearm be stored at all times inside that home if it was not directly worn on your person.
Chief,
Mayor,
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, Mayor, to be clear, the Chief's describing current law, which the penal code provides that, if someone in the home can't possess the firearm, then you have to have a trigger lock or safely store it. What the city could do is say everybody who has a firearm in their home has to safely store it or have a trigger lock on it, no matter who is there or isn't there. That's at the discretion of Morro Bay.
Right. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that clarification. Chief, what I was trying to get to, I guess, maybe to clarify that question, the way I understand existing California law, not the San Francisco policy, if I had, just as an example, a 30-year-old daughter who lived with me in my home, who had been quote unquote normal, if there is such a thing, but no contraindications as far as I can tell with regard to the requirement to safely store any firearms in my house. With my 30-year-old daughter present, if she went into an acute depressive illness that occurred suddenly, does that place her in a category at high risk that currently would require me to safely store my weapons in that situation, or is that outside of that current California law? That makes sense, I hope.
I could refer to you if Chief, unless you wanted to answer that. I have a penal code here. So Penal Code 25100, it basically says that if a child who isn't authorized to be around the firearm, that means under 18, or someone that has a state or federal prohibition already in effect, can't be around the firearm. So the current law does not require the resident of the home to make a judgment on what may or may not happen. The current law requires that if the child is not authorized to be around the firearm, which typically would be someone visiting, or maybe you just don't let your children be around the firearms, then you have to lock it up or put a trigger lock. Or, as the chief mentioned, if somebody's on probation or there's some restriction on them being around firearms, then you have to do it. Then you have to secure it. And the law provides that basically there is strict penalties if then there is some sort of gun violence that occurs, and where they got the gun should have been safely stored and it wasn't. So in short, to answer your question, the law would not require you right now to lock up your gun if you suspect something may happen, but we don't know for sure what's going to happen.
Okay, and that's what I was really looking for. In that situation, obviously, there would be acute changes in the mental status of an individual who was an adult child, 30 years old. And I'm making this up. I don't have a 30-year-old child living with me, but I'm just trying to understand in that situation where the individual may be vulnerable if the existing California law would require me, as an example, to safely store whatever weapons I may have. And the answer I hear you say is no.
It's not a legal requirement based on the situation you're describing.
Okay,
under California law.
I appreciate that. I'm trying to get to in my mind, some of the core issues associated with what I consider to be a very high statistic in terms of how individuals die with guns that aren't stored properly. My other question has to do with the supplemental Morro Bay PD officer mass active shooting. Chief, do you feel that the existing policies for training that we have in effect and the training that your staff undertakes are adequate?
Yes, Mayor, I do believe we currently have very extensive training, and all of our officers currently actively attend active shooter training every year. Now, with that said, training is one of those things that I personally don't believe you ever get enough of. So while all of our officers are trained, I will always recommend additional training. Again, it's police officers are tasked with so many different things that they have to be prepared for, and the only way to do that is by consistent and ongoing training. So any opportunity to increase that level of training, and one of the things that was mentioned in this training is off-duty training. So officers being able to train in an off-duty capacity, where we would send them in plain clothes, where they may be out and about in public and have to rely or respond to a situation while they're off-duty. Because currently, when we're training, they're on the clock, and we send them to a specified department training. So it's adding additional training, and some of it specifically for mass and active shooter situations, and then to be able to bring some of that training back to the community and the public to help educate and train them as well.
And my last question is, and thank you for that. My last question is, in my mind, it doesn't appear that market leveraging of city firearm purchases, either at the local or regional level, is anything that might have significant impact. I'm trying to just get an understanding of perhaps Chief or whoever may want to answer if you feel the same way. Is that something that can even be considered, and would there be an opportunity countywide to look at that, and would it have any impact in your opinion?
I will stress that, we had this conversation about the market leveraging and the impact. And again, as our attorney indicated, Morro Bay itself is so small that we probably wouldn't have a lot of impact on market leveraging. But I will say this, and there are about, I want to say about 44 gun manufacturing places that have now, in reference to market leveraging, that conversation has been started at the national level. About 44 gun manufacturing companies are now not going to do business with law enforcement based on their stances. And their position is this, that, they don't necessarily need law enforcement as customers, because there are literally tens of millions of customers that they have that they're going to sell firearms and weapons to. But on the other hand, law enforcement will always need ammunition and firearms. So we have to be very careful about how we approach that market leveraging conversation, so that, again, we're not putting ourselves at odds with the people that we depend on to provide us with some of the tools and resources that we need to do the jobs that we need to do every day.
Thank you, Chief. I appreciate that. That's my last question. And with that, I'm going to go to public comment. This is public comment.
Mayor, could I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
Chief, 44 manufacturers out of how many?
That's a good question.
I mean, not specifically, but is it lots of, I guess I'm just wondering percentage, is that half the gun manufacturers, 3/4?
I'm sure there's thousands of manufacturers.
Okay.
But I just point that out because as that conversation about market leveraging starts to come into play, that's what some law enforcement agencies are seeing as a result of that type of pressure applied towards the business.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me interrupt, Mayor.
Sure, no, not a problem at all. With that, I'll go ahead and open up public comment. This is public comment for item C-2 on the agenda this evening. Public comment for this item is now open. And Anthony, I'll ask if there's any public comment, sir.
Yes, Mayor. I do see one hand raised. Rita Casaverde, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Welcome, Rita.
Okay, Rita, you are unmuted.
Thank you so much. I just want to say that I really enjoyed this meeting. I really like the amount of discussion that you guys are having around each topic. It's really appreciated. I also want to mention before my comment that your webpage is very organized and it was very easy to find the link for the city council meeting. So props to your staff for that. Thank you for doing that work and making it easy for everyone to participate. About this agenda item, thank you for bringing the report and again for the discussion. As a woman of color, I really go through the trauma when there are shootings or when we hear that people have died because of shootings. And I know that a lot of men also are killed through suicide because of guns and gun safety. I really would like to ask the city council members to support in taking action in any way that you can, because it is a true issue, and I think everyone in the community and around the country is just wondering who's going to be next, and if it's going to happen in our household or at our schools or at the places that we go to. And it's a hard reality that we all have to live through, but I think that city council meetings and cities like yours that spend the time to have these thoughtful conversations is where the change is going to happen. So I really hope that the city council can recommend staff to take any action that they can, especially advocacy with the community and education, because I think it will make a difference. So thank you again for all the work that you're doing. The only thing that I would suggest for the staff, if possible, while I have a little bit more of time, is if you guys could upload these videos on YouTube, because sometimes we are not able to join when the meetings are happening, and it's always nice to see them later. Maybe there is a way to see them later through the website. I'll check that out, but I know some cities or some boards have them live on YouTube as well. So you could use like two tools if you were multitasking. But other than that, you guys are doing an amazing job, and I'm just really thankful for the discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Casaverde. Anthony, next public comment, please.
Yes, Mayor. I have a phone number ending in 327.
Okay.
Phone caller from phone number 327. If you want to press *6 to unmute yourself. Okay, you are unmuted.
Thank you, Anthony, for reminding me to push *6. I appreciate that. I'm not quite used to that yet. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is Dan Sedley speaking.
Welcome, Dan.
I want to start, Mr. Mayor, by talking about the Constitution and the wise people that wrote the Constitution that were concerned about the lack of human rights from the places that they came to this country from. Some of those rights being the right to defend themselves, the right to possess a firearm, so many things. One of the things that the Founding Fathers wrote about in the Federalist Papers was that the reason for the Second Amendment was to protect against the tyranny of government. And I realize that this is an extremely popular place to talk about that, since this is a government meeting, but that's a fact. You can't, if a government takes away all of our rights, we have no way to change that government. If they're subverting the Constitution, if they're telling us we can't go to church because of the flu, when the First Amendment clearly says we have the right to assemble peacefully. The Constitution is the ruling law of the land. And in the end, when a law goes up through the appellate courts and up to the top, it goes to the Supreme Court to rule on the constitutionality of any law. I want to thank Chris Neumeier and Chief Jody Cox for their comments and their aspects. One of the things that I found missing from Mr. Neumeier was the cost of cities that have been sued and the amounts and payments that they've had to make, even for attorney fees and losing those civil suits. I have seen copies of checks from different municipalities and governments to pro-Second Amendment associations in significant amounts that would extremely harm our city and society. I want to make a comment about gun-free zones. From my perspective, they've become shooting galleries. They have not protected our youth or our government. They have made them susceptible to extreme fatal harm. And people need to think about that when they're making these gun-free zones, about where armed citizens can possess weapons. We're talking about people with CCWs. These people have.
Thank you. You're about 3 minutes and 20 seconds.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you so much. Yes. Anthony, next public comment, please.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I do not see any raised hands left in the queue.
Okay, thank you. I'll go ahead and close public comment on item C-2. Bring it back to council for, and again, this is for direction on any of the areas as outlined in the staff report that were well articulated by Chris, that you would like further information or further guidance on, or potentially bring back something that you may want to consider as policy. And so I'll go ahead and start with Councilmember Addis, if I could, please. Comments and thoughts?
Sure, I do have a few thoughts. Thank you, Mayor. And I want to reiterate, thank you so much for this report. I know there was extensive work that was put into this staff report, and thank you to Chief Cox and Officer Miller for putting your time and energy into this. And I know that it's a hard issue, and in a place like Morro Bay that feels relatively safe every day, it's a hard issue to talk about because we could very easily just ignore it and hope that nothing happens here. But hope really isn't much of a plan. And I want to just talk a little bit about a couple of the incidents that were mentioned in the report on May 23rd, 2014. I think I mentioned already one of the victims of the Isla Vista shooter was Christopher Ross Michaels Martinez, age 20, who was a San Luis Obispo high school student and whose father continues to live in Los Osos. And on October 2017, when a lone gunman massacred 59 people at the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival in Las Vegas, one of the people who was shot was Samantha Ferrata. And her father, at the time, worked at Baywood Elementary School. And he started a GoFundMe. Her mother lives in Cayucas. This was all publicized. But her father started a GoFundMe because her life was upended. She was in the hospital for a very long time. She had to go through recovery. And I will add that in regards to the shootings at the synagogues, any person who's in contact with the Jewish community knows that every time there's a synagogue shooting, it's a reminder of threats of extreme violence against the Jewish community, as well as other underrepresented people who do live here in Morro Bay. And with the suicide rate being 60% of firearm-related deaths, I'm sure that there are families in Morro Bay who have experienced this tragedy or will experience this tragedy in the future. And lastly, I'll just say that I myself was a named victim in a credible death threat made by a person in San Luis Obispo who had possession of multiple firearms and quite a bit of ammunition. And we were extremely fortunate that that situation didn't get worse than it was. So when I asked council to add this to our agenda, it was around the time of the Virginia Beach City Hall and the Gilroy shootings. And we had staff that expressed fear about the safety of our community in light of those shootings. And at the time, it would have been easy to say, oh no, it will never happen here. But again, hope is really not a plan. And so I want to appreciate this council and appreciate this staff and say that I'm really proud that we have the courage to talk about an issue that a lot of people would rather ignore. In terms of the specific options, I would be in support of a safe storage measure here in Morro Bay, resolution or ordinance that is is created based on the San Francisco policy or another policy that has stood up legally. I appreciate that this could help prevent suicide. I think that's really the main goal. If Morro Bay were to do something around safe storage laws, it would be to try to bring down that number of 60% of suicides using a gun. In terms of firearm owners' liability insurance, I think this has a lot of potential, but I do believe we should circle back after we know the outcomes in San Jose. I think they have much more resources to fight that battle right now than we do. In terms of concealed carry permits on public property, I don't see making changes in this area. In terms of the firearms businesses questions, there were 4 items listed there. I don't see making any changes. I didn't hear anything from staff or in the report that made it seem like we would get movement here in Morro Bay that would matter. When it comes to firearm safety education programs, I'm very supportive of education and would like to see more of that in our community, especially in regards to suicide, which I think is likely the biggest issue that we would have here so far. Although I am reflective of the chief's comments that we're seeing more and more gun violence across the Central Coast. In terms of a buyback, I would support that if we felt like we have the resources to put it in place. I would love to see it happen at least once, and then we could make a judgment about if we wanted to see it in the future. And I am very supportive of supplemental Morro Bay PD officer mass and active shooter training. I think that's critical, and I was actually kind of surprised coming from a school district where we do numerous trainings and run drills that Morro Bay hasn't done more training. And I'm very supportive of the off-duty training as well. And when it comes to advocacy at the federal and state levels, I do believe that that is where real change will happen. I'm proud of California for the laws that we do have in place. I do think we need to do more at the federal level and would be very appreciative of Morro Bay City Council taking a stance and advocating, especially now that there looks like there could be some movement at the federal level. So the same for gun violence restraining order awareness. I would like to see a public campaign about that, especially because it's a new law. I know that aspects of it have been in place for 5 years, but if we could save even one life with that. And the chief mentioned we did have an issue of gun violence recently in Morro Bay, that it was somebody who came from out of town and that it had to do with their relationship. And it just made me wonder if the person in their own community or the person that they came to shoot at had been able to get a gun violence restraining order, would they have come here and committed gun violence? So I do think we need more education in this area. And when it comes to market leveraging, I would like to see us look into this more. It's not a hill for me to die on, but I do think there's potential there, especially if we were able to make bridges across our county. So again, I just want to say thank you to council and thank you to staff for taking up this issue. I think it's an important one. And even though we're small, I do believe Morro Bay voices matter and our votes matter. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Addison. Thank you for taking those one by one and expressing a position. It makes it easier for the facilitator and note taker when it comes to summary time. And so, again, thank you for your comments. And I'll go ahead and move to Councilmember Heller, sir. Comments.
Alrighty, thank you, Mayor, and thank you again, Chris and Chief Cox and Officer Miller for your contribution to the conversation. And I am proud of our council for even talking about this issue, which is so complex. And the mass shootings that we've seen across the country recently are very disturbing, I think, for everyone. When we look at our suicide rate and the use of handguns, it's alarming. I like to step back and look at our culture, and from what I read, we have an enormous gun culture in this country. We have more guns per capita than any country in the world except India, which means pretty much that guns are everywhere. And that's a tough long-term challenge, I think, for us to face as a nation, as a state, and as a city. In looking at these regulations, I'm very proud of what California has in place. I think we are the leader in the nation in terms of gun control legislation, as we should be, and I think that's something to be proud of. Of the wide variety of things here listed, the only one that kind of appeals to me is the buyback program. I was surprised to hear that Officer Miller suggested that we might collect 142 guns in a one buyback program that would cost about $15,000. Also, I believe Councilmember Addis suggested that we might work with another agency to have more of a joint program so that it wouldn't just be our resources being expended. And I'm not sure how we could keep, although it's not necessarily a bad thing, but don't know if we should be buying guns back from outside the city. I'm sure there's some way to regulate that to make sure that if we do buy back firearms, they will be from residents. I wish we could legislate something that would change our culture, that would stop the mass shootings, that would stop the use of assault weapons, that would stop suicides, that would stop domestic disputes ending in gun violence, that would stop gun violence related to drug wars and street violence, but it's not something we can legislate. A lot of these issues, I think, are well-intended, or these policies are well-intended, but frankly, I'm not sure that they're going to do a lot to help the issue. But I do support the concept of looking more closely at a buyback program. That's what I have at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Heller. Appreciate that. Let me move to Councilmember Barton, please. Summary comments.
I appreciate the work that went into this report, and also the comments of the two previous council members. This has been a very tough thing to weed through with so many ideas, and a number of them seem perhaps marginally effective, but it's such a huge problem. I would agree that we are probably just one shooting away from having our own need to address gun violence in Morro Bay. It doesn't seem possible, but it is possible, and so looking over all these possibilities, it's been a lot to take in at once. I appreciate Don in particular having weeded through these to come up with a number of things that perhaps we could take a boiled down version of the report and deal with, say, 3 or 5 or a number like that, because there is just so much to take in here. So anyway, I appreciate all the work that went into this, and am giving it a lot of thought.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that. Councilmember Davis, sir.
Yes, I don't want to add to a long conversation. So I will just say that I will go along with Councilmember Addis's recommendations, recognizing that we're a penny in a teacup. But I recognize that even though we can't do everything, we can do something. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Davis. And there we go. Thank you all for taking the time to entertain the subject. I'll tell you, we've taken some criticism from some of our constituents for even putting this on the agenda, indicating that it's not a local issue. Why are we discussing it? And we should be spending our time on issues that are more pertinent to our locale. And I'll just disagree with that because, I think about the other communities where this list of shootings that Chris has outlined in our report, I wonder just if they considered after the fact, after these shootings occurred, boy, it would have been good to proactively think about guns and control and any of the issues that might influence what may have happened in the city. And I certainly can tell you that we as a city, God forbid, should an incident like this occur in the city of Morro Bay, would have received criticism for not talking about this if we hadn't entertained it this evening. So again, I think it not only quite appropriate, but also very timely from a national perspective, and more recently what's been going on in the country with an increase in the shootings. Not to prolong the conversation, but I absolutely agree with Councilmember Addis's summary on all the points that she made. I support the safe storage policy, potential development similar to San Francisco, and would support something like that coming back. I agree that liability insurance is not something that at this time I have an appetite for because of potential litigation. Public property, I also agree with regard to that issue that I do not support that as having something that could have significant impact. I think there's enough federal and state regulation of our businesses. So like Councilmember Addis, I do not support any change in terms of adding anything locally to those restrictions or requirements. I do support item E, safety education. Item F, buyback program. Councilmember Heller also indicated support. I also think that we should look into that and bring back more information on how we might be able to accomplish that. I agree that training is absolutely paramount to success in reacting to situations that may occur very infrequently like these shootings. So I also would support increased training and off-duty training. I agree about advocacy, item 2. Do more, take a stance, I think were the comments of Councilmember Addis. And I think that the conversation could be refined to include major issues that are being addressed at the federal level that could be brought via a staff report for consideration. I don't want to have myself have blanket authority to just respond to every gun issue. I would feel comfortable doing that. So I think these are items that individually as they occur, we can raise as future agenda items and definitely bring back for full council discussion. With regard to gun, let's see, what was that? Item 3. Gun violence restraining orders, absolutely. Increased education, I think, is extremely important. And lastly, market leveraging, I'm ambiguous with regard to that. I wouldn't mind hearing more, but I don't have a lot of hope with regard to that specific action that it might offer much change. And so with that, what I sent staff is that with regard to the summary that I just gave, that there's majority support for what I outlined. And unless you have questions, I'll just ask if it is clear. Scott, Chief Cox, Chris?
You know, Mayor, it seems I was taking some notes here on the different council members' positions on these options. Perhaps just to have crystal clarity on what staff's being asked to do. It does seem that Councilmember Heller expressly supported one of the programs. Maybe if we had a motion from Councilmember Heller to pursue a buyback program, and then council could vote on it. And then otherwise, it appears that there's a number of programs that Councilmember Addis has supported. And if Councilmember Addis made a motion for those, then we could at least have clear direction and anticipating based upon the comments the council members made. If a safe storage law was something we were directed to do, then city attorney's office, of course, could bring back an ordinance on that. As for the rest of these programs, I would need to defer to the city manager on, when through cooperation with my office, City Hall, and the police department, on on, what time schedule we'd be looking at for that. I do think that there would be some significant work that we'd want to do on some of these, but that's one possible way to move forward on this if at the mayor's pleasure.
Okay, so I guess, the recommendation is to discuss and provide direction. And I tried to summarize succinctly each member's, you have 3 council members that support what was articulated by Councilmember Addis. I outlined those, but if you would like her to place that into a motion, and if you believe that we need a separate motion for the buyback issue, I'll entertain that after. So, Councilmember Addis, would you like to memorialize that in a motion? Thank you.
Sure. See if I can get this right. I move that council that staff bring back a resolution on safe storage laws. Let me just make sure I have that one right.
Or policy?
The a policy back on safe storage laws. That staff do a public firearm safety education program for the public, that Morro Bay PD has supplemental officer mass active shooter training, that we authorize advocacy at the federal and state levels, that we have staff mounts education program on gun violence restraining order awareness. I think that's the last part of it, and then we'll bring the buyback one after this.
I'll second that motion. Any further discussion? If not, a roll call vote, please.
Councilmember Addis?
Yes.
Councilmember Barton?
Yes.
Councilmember Davis?
Yes.
Councilmember Heller?
No.
Mayor Heading?
Yes.
Motion carries 4-1.
Okay, Councilmember Heller, would you like to make a motion on your recommendation?
Sure. So I'd like to move that staff bring back additional information on a buyback program.
I'll second that. Any further discussion? If not, we'll take a roll call vote, please.
Councilmember Addis?
Yes.
Councilmember Barton?
Yes.
Councilmember Davis?
Yes.
Councilmember Heller?
Yes.
And Mayor Heading?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Good. Chris, did I get it all? Was that...
Yes, Mayor. Thank you so much. It's just easier with the passage of time to sometimes go back to the tapes and just look at a 1-minute summary rather than going back through the full discussion. So it's just for efficiency's sake. So thank you so much.
Totally agree. Thank you for the recommendation and happy to do it. With that, again, thank you for a robust discussion. And that concludes item C-2. That will move us to item D. Council declaration of future agenda items. Got a pretty long list of stuff coming ahead, but if there's something pressing, looking, seeing, hearing none, we'll go to item E, which is adjournment. The next regular meeting of the Morro Bay City Council will be held on Tuesday, April 27th, 2021 at 5:30 p.m. via teleconference. Thank you so much. Have a great evening. Be safe and be well.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Night. Thank you, everyone.